One of my big sewing projects for this year is to make an 1840s evening dress to go to the Prior Attire Ball in Bath. And I've been wanting to do more historical projects for a while now, and as we all know, the first step in creating the historically appropriate silhouette is the appropriate undergarments, which for this era would start with a chemise. Now, a chemise is a relatively straightforward garment, and I've made lots of them before, and yet for some reason I just haven't been able to get started on this project, but that all ends today. Let's get to it. So I've been trying to figure out why I struggled to get started on this project, and then I realised I'd been influenced. I'm sure you, like me, watch a lot of historical sewing content online. There are so many incredible creators out there making amazing historical recreations and doing incredible research, but actually what's happened is the standard for what is really a very beginner-friendly basic garment has gotten so high. And when you do share your work online, there is this sort of continued pressure to justify your audience's attention. And I had convinced myself that unless my chemise was drafted from a historical pattern and hand sewn using appropriate linen thread, then it wasn't good enough. And of course, that's bollocks. And I'm sure all the creators I also watch would probably agree with that. The reality is, I just don't care. You know, it's a chemise. Nobody's gonna see it. I'm really not interested in sewing it. For me, the chemise is a means to an end to get to the pretty dress. And I, as a disabled person, just simply don't have the time and the energy to waste sewing things I'm not excited about. So I gave myself permission to let go. We are making a shitty chemise, and that's okay. So what I did was I went online and I bought one of these Simplicity patterns. This is Simplicity 1139. In the online listing, it said Civil War undergarments, and I'll be honest with you, I'm not entirely sure when that is. I mean, I know roughly. But the reason I was drawn to this one was that it was sort of generic enough that it could do most of the 19th century. And my logic there is I'd like to avoid ever having to do this whole process again, so I want a garment that's going to be as multi-purpose as possible. I'm not making the corset, but I will probably make the bloomers as well. And I know I have enough various weights of cotton in my stash that I don't need to buy any fabric for this. I have plenty of white thread, thanks to my overlocker. So I say we get started.
My first challenge with this pattern was the cutting layout. The front and back pieces are just this big rectangle, but whereas the Victorians would have used the width of the fabric, my fabric was so wide that there wasn't a way to avoid this awkward rectangle along the edge of the fabric. It would just about fit the side panels on, but all the other pieces were too wide to get out of this part. In the end, I decided to just go for it and deal with the wasted fabric later. I'm not using any pins or even weights here. It's a rectangle. It'll be fine. To try and make the most out of the fabric, I put the straight edge of the side piece right up against the cut edge of the square back piece. This not only saves fabric, but it also cuts down the number of long straight edges I have to cut. I then flip the pattern piece so that it'll fit along the selvage, so that's one less raw edge to worry about. Now I watch this back, I wish I had just made the gauze slightly wider so that I didn't waste this long diagonal strip between them. That certainly would have been a more historically accurate way to do it, but hey, I'd committed to following the pattern, so I guess I just ignored all logic and trusted simplicity. With the big pieces cut, I sat down to cut out the rest as efficiently as I could from that wasted fabric along the edge of the big rectangle. I did at this point finally start using pins. I felt accuracy was probably a bit more important for the smaller pieces. Here I'm cutting out the underarm facings. At this point I really wasn't even sure what this piece was for, but we'll come back to these because, well, it was a journey. I ended up ignoring the straight of grain markings for the yoke pieces and cutting them on the cross grain at a 90-degree angle. I just couldn't bring myself to waste all that fabric and meh, it'll be fine. I could barely fit the front yoke pieces on the last bit of this scrap, but it just about fit. Now, something I normally do, which I completely skipped for this project, was to transfer all the notches, sewing lines, small circles. I didn't put a single mark on these fabric pieces. Instead, I just measured things and used pins to mark them as I went along. So here I'm working on the front vent, which has a narrow hem all the way around. Only I didn't actually read the instructions before I cut into the fabric pattern piece, which turned out to be a bad idea because I had already made a mistake. Literally the first instruction and I'd done it wrong. In my defense, I got my 1/2 and 1/4 inch markings confused on my tape measure, which is another of the reasons I hate imperial measurements. But anyway, after finally reading the instructions, I creased back the fabric along that cut edge at 1/2 inch. Only it wasn't supposed to be a 1/2 inch, it was supposed to be a 1/4. I then unfolded that fold and brought the raw edge in to meet that crease, creating another fold at 1/4 inch. Then folded that in again along that crease I just made to create a double fold hem. Then of course repeat for the other side. I then realised I put the pins in the wrong direction and it would be much easier to sew it if they were pointing the other way around, so I changed them. As I didn't add any markings, I had to keep consulting the paper pattern pieces to figure out how this pleat was supposed to work, and then I realised...
I think my opening is bigger than theirs. Whoops, yes it is. Oh well, we'll just have to make a bigger pleat, won't we?
I spent a little while puzzling over how I was going to make this work and would it affect any of the other steps I would have to do later. After a while, I realised it would just mean that the front would be a bit less gathered than the back, so I just went with it. Eventually, after rereading the instructions about 3 times, I was able to make sense of it all, so I stitched the hems on the edge of the opening in place. Basically, what went wrong was I made the hems too wide so that the rectangular opening was too wide, which meant I had to make a much bigger pleat to get the edges to overlap. I then stitched the pleat in place along the bottom of the opening, making sure that the little triangle of fabric was folded down inside the pleat. To reinforce the opening and to make sure that little triangle was secure and wouldn't fray out, I stitched a box with an X in it, like you often see on plackets. This wasn't in the instructions, it was just a little bit of extra reinforcement because I knew I was going to be throwing this garment in the washing machine. With the pleat in place at the centre front, I could add the neck gussets, which were these little triangle pieces. Then it was on to the side gore pieces, which I didn't even pin in place, I just measured down from the top to see where to start the side panel and machined in place, smoothing as I went. The 4 side panels were first stitched to the main body pieces, 2 on the front, 2 on the back. Then the front and back pieces were joined, but only along the straight edge of the side gores. The rest of the seam, the bit without the gores, was left open. And then I decided I'd done enough for one day. I'd actually gotten a lot done for me, and you can probably tell it was getting dark, so I called it a night. So, day 2. I got quite far yesterday. We have a tube with some gussets and vent opening in the front. The next step, in the instructions it calls for flat felt seams, and I did consider doing that because I've never done that before and I thought, oh, that would be great to show my audience. But this cotton lawn, it's very fiddly. Don't have time for that, can't be bothered, so I'm gonna get the overlocker out and overlock everything. So how many more steps have I got after that? Oh, then I'm onto the sleeves, which are weird. I've never seen a sleeve constructed like this before with this underarm guard. I have no idea what's going on there. And then the yoke, which is a few more steps. So I'd say we're about a third of the way through the instructions. Hopefully it will be a little quicker for me because they have some applied lace detailing on the yoke and the sleeves. I'm not going to bother with that. Nobody's going to see it. So it's not the best day today. It's really cold. I got lipstick on my puffer jacket thing. So I'm just feeling a bit cack-handed today, basically. So let's hope everything goes all right. Hang on, I have to double check which bits get enclosed. I had to be really careful when overlocking the seam allowances that I didn't catch anything under the needle and the blade that I wasn't supposed to. There was also a weird moment where the side panel started, so I decided to just overlock the 2 layers of seam allowance together. This made things a bit trickier later, but it was fast and secure. I basically just didn't want to ever have to do this again, so I went for strength and durability. So for the first time on this project, I'm getting my iron out. So I'm just going to give everything I've done a bit of a press. You can see here I've got some grubby thread from my sewing machine not doing what it was supposed to. Right, let's press these into place. Let's press the overlocking, hopefully get some of that crinkling out. Crack out the sleeve board. I think let's push these towards the gusset. You can see this lawn's very sheer. Whoops, maybe not ideal. The reveal for this might be interesting. So, with right sides together, pin underarm gusset to one side edge of sleeve. It actually took me a little while to make sense of how this all went together, because one side of the gusset had this angled off corner, and of course I hadn't transferred all the markings. It was easy to get these white squares and rectangles confused. Once I eventually figured out which way up everything was supposed to go, I pinned the gusset to the sleeve and then realised that the next step would be to sew gathering stitches into the sleeve, which would be much easier if the gusset wasn't flapping about all over the place. So I took the pins out again and turned my stitch length up to sew 2 rows of gathering stitches along the bottom of the sleeves. Then I pinned the gussets back in place and machined them between the small circles. These small circles on commercial patterns are often to mark the junction at the sewing line between 2 pattern pieces, so they're a seam allowance width in from the edge, which makes them pretty easy to estimate using the markings on my stitch plate. Then the other edge of the gusset has to be joined to the other edge of the sleeve. I flipped the sleeve around so that I started sewing from the point where I finished sewing the other side of the gusset. This meant that I can really precisely start the stitching exactly where I finished the other line of stitching, making sure that all my seam allowances are flat and nothing is caught where it shouldn't be. Again, I finished sewing at the small circle, which is just 1.5 centimeters in from the edge. I then seamed the sleeve cuffs into a tube, matching right sides together and reversing at each end. You can see this red thread through the selvage here, which as it turns out is still visible through the fabric of the cuff. Part of me really wishes I'd taken it out, but I didn't, so I'll have to live with it. Then I creased those seams open with my fingers before pressing them in place using my sleeve board. Then I measured and pressed the seam allowance to the wrong side. This is something commercial patterns have you do to make finishing the inside easier, but after doing it for this project, I don't think it's any easier or quicker. I then realised I'd missed a step when installing the gussets and needed to seam up the bottom section of the sleeves. Again, I very carefully started stitching exactly where I had stopped at the bottom of the gusset. I then pulled on the gathering threads to shrink the sleeve down to the same size as the cuff and pinned the edge of the cuff I hadn't pressed under earlier to the sleeve with right sides together. I then took a break from the sleeves to prep all the remaining pieces that needed to be joined together, the yoke pieces and then those mysterious underarm guards. Then taking the tray table off my machine, I stitched the cuffs onto the gathered bottom of the sleeves, taking my time to make sure the gathers all lay nicely. With the cuffs now stitched on and holding the gathers in place, I could remove the gathering threads before pressing the cuffs into position. First I pressed the cuff down away from the sleeve, setting the gathers in place, and then I began folding the cuff into position on the wrong side, matching up that pressed under edge with my line of stitching, so that the folded edge was just past the stitching by 1 millimeter or so, making it easier to stitch in place later. And well, you know me, always batching my tasks, so while I had the iron out, I pressed the seams open on the yoke pieces I had joined together earlier, which was when I noticed this mysterious blue gunk right in the middle of the back piece. Oh well, it's at the back. I then also pressed open the seams on the mysterious underarm guards before getting out my wool pressing mat to press the seam allowances under easier.
How much am I pressing it under? 1/4 inch.
Fiddling about with those tiny seam allowances was incredibly annoying, particularly around the curved edges at the bottom. If I'd been able to use steam on my iron, I might have been able to shrink some of the excess out, but the steam function has stopped working on my iron, and of course I could have clipped the excess out, but with so little seam allowance that would make it vulnerable to fraying, so I decided to just struggle. I also pressed under the much more reasonable 1.5 centimeters seam allowances along the bottom of the facing pieces. Although it was here where I really wish I could have chalked on the seam allowances, as this would have been much easier to do with an actual line to follow. Before I could attach the sleeves, I had to neaten the seam allowances of the gussets with flat felt seams. To make a flat felt seam, you trim down 1/2 of the seam allowance and then fold the other half over it, pinning it to the fabric of the garment to keep everything flat and enclosed. As I had suspected, this was very fiddly on this lightweight lawn, and I had to fuss with the bottom of the triangle where the gusset comes to a point with the sleeve seam to make it sit flat and not catch the sleeve at a funny angle. With everything pinned, I could start top stitching the flat felt seams in place. You can of course do this by hand, but I didn't have time for that and I decided against using my top stitching foot, as I find on lightweight fabrics it can push the edge I'm following out of line. I then machined the cuffs to enclose the bottom of the sleeves. In the end, I just top stitched the cuff rather than try and do a sink stitch or stitch in the ditch. Again, my goal was speed and durability here, and this method was the strongest and most likely to work first time. I then prepped the yoke, joining the two pieces along the top curved edge with right sides together. Then it was time to insert the sleeves. Now, what was so strange about the sleeve construction is there's no yoke portion of the chemise yet, so you're only attaching the bottom half of the sleeve. The armhole is also rectangular, so you have to do the short bottom edge first, which is the top of the side gauze, and then attach the rest, starting at the neck gussets and machining down to create a corner with the line of stitching you've already sewn. With all the seams from all the gussets, this was tricky and I didn't get it right the first time. I caught up all the seam allowances where I wasn't supposed to, so I had to try again.
Well, I've gotten quite a lot done today. I mean, it's starting to look like a chemise, isn't it? And I've got the sleeves in and done all of that. The only thing I'm up to next is these underarm facings. To my surprise, this pattern, it has some historical accuracies, particularly in terms of the cut. So they must have included this underarm facing for some historical logic. However, they have you construct it in a modern way where it doesn't make any sense. Do you know what I mean? What the Victorians probably would have done is just turned under the both edges, pinned it on and whipped it in place by hand. But because it's a simplicity pattern, what they're having you do is like completely try and bag it out, and you have to clip the corners and like flip everything, and it's a bit convoluted and weird, and I just don't. I mean, it's getting dark, it's 5 o'clock, you know, kind of just had enough for today, so I think I'm gonna leave that for tomorrow. But yeah, all in all, good progress, I'd say. Welcome back, day 3 now, and it's time to face these underarm facing things. I've got my tea. So I don't know if I'm able to even explain to you how this works. I think I'll just have to show you. So let's get right to it. What I don't understand is if I am sewing through just the seam allowance or whether I'm sewing through all the layers, including the fabric of the gusset like that. I think it must be all the layers. This is so complicated. Nope, I'm doing this wrong. Oh my God. And then I flip that down. But then what's the point of that? Oh my God, this doesn't make any sense. What am I even supposed to be doing? But then they've got the... Oh my God, simplicity, what is the matter with you? So when something like this happens and I can't make sense of what the hell is going on, I always find it's most useful to reverse engineer it. So to start with how I want it to look when it's finished, which in this case is this over this, like that. Or at least I think that's what they're going for. And then this is somehow top stitched on here. It doesn't really seem necessary to me to have this facing. I could surely just fold under and fell it. What's the benefit of having this facing? Oh, I suppose it's to cover up this bit as well, isn't it? Okay, there is a logic. But even so, let's just top stitch it on. I'm not faffing about with that. I'm just going to put in a few reverse stitches before I pivot around to really reinforce this point where I've cut the fabric. Because the likelihood is it'll fray. Like I said, I'm really not bothered about this. I really do not care what it looks like.
For the other sleeve, I did make an attempt at the method the pattern suggested, but I don't think it was any quicker or neater in the end.
So you know, I was like, I really do not care. I'm just going to whack it on. It'll be fine. Yeah, I'm going to unpick this half because it's just not sitting properly. I've missed some of it here. I haven't caught it down. This is just annoying me. I was pressing it and I was like, can I iron out all those wrinkles? Turns out, no, I can't. So yeah, I think I'm going to unpick this section and do it again. But this side, I mean, it's not perfect, but it's acceptable.
With the underarm guards finally on, I used a long stitch to run gathering stitches along the top edge of the body and sleeves of the chemise in one line, including over the triangular neck gussets. The underarm guards ended up longer than the gussets, so I just trimmed them down to match. I realised too late that it would have been much easier to sew the gathering stitches in stages to match up the chemise to the yoke better, but I forgot about it, so oh well. I then notched the curve of the yoke seam ready to turn it right sides out. I don't like to clip the corners of waistbands and pieces like this yoke because they're so likely to fray, so instead I very carefully folded my seam allowances and turned the point of the yoke piece over the seam allowance to get a crisp edge. I then started finger pressing along the seam to make it easier to iron in place. I used this method all along the yoke to get the seam right along the edge. I then pulled on the gathering threads to fit the chemise into the edge of the yoke. Because I didn't have any markings and I'd made the pleat at the front too big, I just had to guess how to distribute the volume, but it worked out okay. I then machined the yoke onto the chemise, being careful to stroke the gathers into place as I went. I could then press the yoke round to the wrong side and then into position, enclosing the raw edges and matching that folded edge up to my stitching line so I could top stitch it in place. This was tricky at times because of the curved shape of the yoke. It wanted to stretch on the bias. I didn't do a brilliant job of keeping it smooth, but it is at least secure. I also top stitched around the top edge of the yoke. This was sort of decorative, but I was also worried about this slippery cotton lawn distorting once the chemise was on, so it was also for strength and structure. The majority of the construction was now complete, so I started on the hem, turning and pressing it up once and then a second time and pinning it into place. I machined the hem in place. There's already so much top stitching on this thing, I didn't see the point of starting hand sewing now.
See this here? This is where my bobbin ran out on the hem. I was so nearly done.
Then all I needed was a closure at the centre front. They suggested buttons and loops, and that seemed sensible enough to me, so I found some appropriate buttons in my stash. I have some nice vintage lingerie buttons, but as this is my shitty chemise, I didn't really want to use them here. Instead, I settled on these plastic Pearl Effect ones. I stitched the buttons on, making sure the placket was going to overlap nicely, and then started work on the thread loops. I had originally wanted to use a thicker embroidery floss, but I didn't have a true white, so I used just ordinary sewing thread. With hindsight, I think this was a mistake and I'd change this in the future, because it didn't want to stay shut when worn. But with those hand stitches, it meant the chemise was finally done.
So it's all finished, and I went to try it on for the final reveal. It's much too big. So what I did was I got a willing volunteer, aka my mum, to pin a pleat in the back. Because it's like an off-the-shoulder design, I cut this piece, the yoke piece, to be the size I would normally make, which is a 12 for a commercial pattern like this, forgetting that I often make shoulder adjustments to things because I've got narrower shoulders than average, I guess. And yeah, it just slips right off the shoulder, which I don't think it's supposed to do. You see, on the ladies here, it really sits on the roll of the shoulder, and mine was sitting like here, off the shoulder, completely straight across the top of the bust. And I don't think I want that, so I think I'll make it a box pleat. I'll sew along there, and then I'll iron it like that, so that it's centred, and then maybe just machine it in place at the top as well. I think that'll do. And you know, when I said I was going to press it, I'm not even going to bother with that. Just going to finger press it. I need a pin there, I think. Ta-da! It's done!
I don't really know what to say in terms of conclusion for this video. Normally, I like to include a few little critiques, pros and cons, that sort of thing, but my overwhelming feeling with this project is, yeah, it's done. I think in the wider context of my sewing practice, this project was good for me. It reminded me that sewing isn't always about the process or an artistic expression. Sometimes you just need something quickly and cheaply, and sewing is the best way to get it. And now I have a chemise. I have a few more undergarments to make before I can get started on the ball gown, but I've finally gotten started. Thanks for watching. See you next time.
So in the last video in this series, I made a chemise, which is the primary undergarment for my 1840s ensemble to go to the ball in Bath. And I could have just stopped here with the undergarments. It was very common in this era for a chemise to be the only undergarment women wore, but you could also have a pair of bloomers, or as the Victorians called them, drawers. But that was very much up to sort of personal preference, if you like, and they're much less common in this 1840s era than they are towards the end of the 19th century. However, many of my friends and colleagues who were also going to the ball, and in fact many of you in the comments, had recommended that I make a pair of bloomers, as it makes visiting the loo while wearing all those many layers and enormous skirts much easier than wearing modern underwear, and it's preferable to the other historically accurate option, which is going commando. I also knew that as somebody with mobility and balance issues, and I was going to an event that was hopefully going to involve some dancing for me, there was a very high likelihood that I was going to fall flat on my face. And I would also be doing things like clambering in and out of the back of an Uber, which is difficult for me at the best of times, never mind with all the skirts. And I would be in a very busy city centre. So I decided I wanted just a bit more coverage. So I just used the same pattern that I already had for the chemise, Simplicity 1139. It looked pretty straightforward. There were only 3 pattern pieces, and I had enough leftover cotton in my stash from a different project that I could use for this. It was heavier weight than the cotton lawn that I used for the chemise, but not so heavy as a quilting cotton. So, should we get started?
The pattern piece for the leg of the bloomers was so big I couldn't fit it on my cutting table, so I had to pin it in 2 halves, cutting as much as would fit on the table before shifting everything up to pin the rest of the pattern piece on and cut out the bottom of the leg. The smaller pattern pieces had to be cut from the offcuts from the massive leg piece, so I sat down to pin them on and cut them out, being as economical with the fabric as I could. I had learnt my lesson from the chemise that skipping the marking up really doesn't save any time, because I knew I would just end up sewing something wrong later when I couldn't make sense of the instructions. This did mean I had to wear the bloomers covered in yellow marks, but guess what? Nobody noticed. I started by joining the waistband pieces. The instructions have you leave a little gap in the seam to thread a cord through later. Then I joined the inside leg seams on the leg of the bloomers, making sure to match the balance marks. This was the only seam for the legs, so this went pretty quickly. Then I pressed open all the seams. The inside leg seam was slightly curved, so it was a little tricky, but using my sleeve board really helped. You might have noticed no seam finish yet. We'll come to that next. I wanted to do flat felled seams for the bloomers. It seemed the neatest, strongest and quickest way to finish the raw edges, so I trimmed down one side of the seam allowance on the inside leg seam, pressed the other half so that it lay over the trimmed half, and then carefully folded the seam allowance over to enclose the trimmed edge before carefully pressing it in place. This was still fiddly, but I was using a heavier, firmer cotton for the bloomers, so it was less fiddly than the flat felt seams I'd done on the lightweight cotton lawn of the chemise. Once pressed, I pinned the seam allowance in place before continuing down the length of the seam. It was trickiest where the seam began to curve sharply. I had to sort of ease in the excess fabric to keep everything smooth, but when it was all pinned in place, I set the legs aside to press under the seam allowance for the waistband. As usual, batching my tasks here. I already had the iron out and hot, so I pressed everything I could before moving back to my sewing machine. So I began by joining the 2 pieces of the waistband together, leaving the bottom edge open to attach the bloomers. Then it was time to top stitch the flat felt seams. Now it's very difficult to sew a vertical line down a tube on a sewing machine because you can't really get it under the needle without catching the other side. I was only able to flat fell this seam by machine because the circumference of the leg on these bloomers was so wide I could bunch all the fabric up and still have room to sew. It wasn't the easiest seam to sew, but it was worth it. To decorate the bottom edge of the bloomers, I made a little ruffle out of some embroidery anglaise I've had in my stash for over 10 years, joining it into a cuff with a flat felled seam and using a long stitch length to sew a gathering thread around the top edge.
I've done something really dumb. When I measured the amount of lace I needed for the cuffs, I measured across like this and I doubled it. And then I cut the lace that size. So I didn't put any, you're supposed to like double or 2.5 times the circumference of the cuff to get the ruffle. Oh my God, what an idiot. I went to put this on. Guess what? It gathered down like this much. Oh. So after beautifully flat fell seaming this, I'm unpicking.
So I cut some more of the embroidery anglaise and I did another beautiful little flat felled seam to join the two previous pieces together before trimming down the curved edge to become a straight one and running gathering stitches along the now long enough to actually gather top edge.
So another dilemma I'm facing with applying this trim is that it said to match the raw edges and stitch at 5/8 of an inch, but that will mean I catch the top of my little embroidered flowers here, so I'm having to offset it ever so slightly so that that doesn't happen. Oh, I suppose I should go like this and match the halfway point and all of that. That'll do. It's approximate, but oh well. I've only got one gathering thread, so I'll have to be very careful. I think their trim was probably wider than mine, so I don't know how this is going to look, but oh well, we're doing it.
After much fiddling with the gathers, I could then machine the gathered lace onto the bottom of the cuff. This still involved lots of fiddling to get the gathers to lay nicely, and I wasn't entirely sure I was going to like the way this looked when finished. With the lace on, I turned the raw edges to the wrong side and pressed the lace down so that the raw edges were poking up inside the leg of the bloomer. I then decided to use one of the decorative stitches on my machine to hold the raw edges in place and hopefully prevent fraying. The sewing pattern didn't give satisfactory instructions for this bit, so this was just my own interpretation based on some original examples I've seen. Naturally, the historically accurate way would be to use a decorative hand stitch, but I couldn't be bothered with that.
Can you see it?
I did some samples to make sure I liked the way it looked and played around with the stitch length before sewing the seam allowance in place with that stitch. I then joined the two legs of the bloomers together at the crotch until the balance mark. These are open drawers, meaning most of the crotch seam isn't attached, one of the few historical accuracies of this pattern. The rest of the crotch seam and the raw edges of the seamed bit are hemmed by rolling them twice. I pressed and pinned these edges in place before machining them with a straight stitch. No decorative stitch necessary, as hopefully nobody at the ball will be getting close enough to have a good look. I then tacked the pleat at the centre front in place. Before running gathering stitches along the top edge of the bloomers, ready to gather them down to fit in the waistband. The bloomers were stitched onto the half of the waistband that I hadn't pressed under earlier with right sides together. I went slowly to make sure I didn't catch any of the gathers in a weird way, and then I could fold the waistband over to enclose the raw edges. I pressed the seam allowance up into the waistband and then pressed the waistband down over the seam so that the folded under edge matched the stitching line of the seam. This then got pinned in place so I could machine it in place. I used my top stitching foot as I knew I wanted a visible top stitch rather than a stitch in the ditch. Yes, you get visible stitching, but it's faster and more secure. I then had to machine a channel for the drawstring ties to run through, but only on the back half of the waistband. Using a safety pin on one end, I threaded a length of narrow cotton twill tape through the openings I had left when making up the waistband, from one end of the back panel to the other. Only this proved really tricky to get out again because of the seam allowances.
As well, I literally could have sewn this into the seam when I was doing it. Oh my god, oh, finally.
I then had to machine the end of that tape in place after poking it through the opening to the inside of the waistband. I ended up pivoting around it to make a little square of stitching for strength, as the tape seemed likely to fray under tension. It turned out I actually sewed the tape on the right side, but oh well, the bloomers were done.
Fuck it.
Much like the chemise, I don't really have much to say about these bloomers. I'm glad I made them, and I was surprised by how accurate and usable this simplicity pattern was. But I hope that if you're new to costuming and relying on these often questionable Big Four patterns, seeing someone with my experience struggling to make sense of the instructions helped you realise it's not you. I still think this was a quicker and more energy efficient option for me, despite my struggles. The bloomers and chemise came together in just a few days, and if you don't have to take as many breaks as I do, you could probably put them together over a few evenings. Most importantly, it's a start. I'm on my way, and now for the real challenge, the corset. Thanks for watching. See you next time.
Now, you've seen the title of this video, and I can already hear the clackety-clack of the folks writing shitty comments even now. But before I get into the making of the corset for the ball, I have some things to say, so buckle up. Whenever I, or anybody else for that matter, mentions online that wearing corsets just isn't a pleasant experience for me, I inevitably get a tirade of responses explaining to me how I'm wrong and corsets are great and you must just be stupid. And I'm fed up with this frankly incredibly ableist attitude. And yes, the online historical sewing community has done a lot to fight corset misinformation about things like people having their ribs removed and all that other bullshit. But when I, as a disabled person, talk about my experience of wearing corsets, all I get is abuse. For context, I have ME, which for the purposes of this video means I have chronic pain and chronic fatigue. I also have lumbothoracic scoliosis, so that's not one, but two lateral curves in my spine. I am literally S-shaped. It also means that my shoulders and hips are at different angles and my rib cage is rotated to face that way, while my hips and lower body rotate to face the other way. And if your reaction to that was, ooh, sounds painful, yeah, it is. And I struggle with any kind of pressure on my distorted muscles, even tightly fitting modern clothing, elastic waistbands, bra straps. Never mind a garment that is designed to dramatically compress the body and include several long vertical rods of metal or plastic running down it. But if I bring this up, the response I get is, "Oh no, you're doing it wrong. You're wearing a cheap, nasty, off-the-rack corset. You need a custom-made, top-of-the-range corset and then you'll see that you're wrong." Never mind the fact that that just isn't an accessible option for most people. Not just financially, but in terms of physical access. Custom corset makers are few and far between, and so unless you're lucky enough to live near one or willing and able to travel for fittings, it's just physically not possible to get your hands on one, even if you do have that kind of money. But also it just ignores the wealth of evidence that we have that that's just not what people did in history. For a community so good at research and so enthusiastic about historical accuracy, it amazes me that we still peddle this notion that all corsets in the past were custom made, when by the second half of the 19th century, most middle-class women were wearing a ready-to-wear corset, and by the end of the 19th century, most working-class women were wearing a ready-to-wear corset. For goodness sake, one of the most notorious, well-documented examples of mass-produced corsetry from this era is literally called the Pretty Housemaid. And yes, modern ready-to-wear corsets are no comparison to the historical ones, but they were still a standard size. You could maybe customize the fit a little when you ordered them, but they weren't made to measure. Besides, we have a lot of surviving examples of incredibly low-quality homemade stays and corsets that were obviously made by folks without the skills or the time to make them fit perfectly. So I'm sure they had to deal with things like pinching and fit issues too. Also, random stranger on the internet, you know nothing about the sorts of corsets I've been wearing, because all the corsets I've ever worn have been made by a professional theatrical costumier with over 10 years experience working on corsetry. Me. This guy. I made them for myself, custom made to me, and they were still bloody painful to wear. So this leaves me and my painful, exhausted body between a rock and a hard place. Even if I could afford to buy a corset from one of the companies making ready-to-wear historical recreations, it still wouldn't be custom fit to my wonky body, so what's the point? A custom corset just isn't an option for me, so should I just buy a cheap ready-to-wear one and accept that I'm going to be in pain and miserable no matter what? There is, of course, the other option of making my own. I arguably have the skills to produce one of the standard of a full-time corset maker, but it's a long process with lots of toiles and lengthy involved fittings. Even with my energy limitations aside, that's still a lot of work to go through to end up with a corset that is still going to be frigging torture for me to wear, simply because my body is never going to cooperate. And the prospect of putting myself through such an ideal with my limited energy and an approaching deadline is just madness. So naturally, that's what I did. As far as I could see, I didn't really have any other option. I know there's the argument that you can fake the fashionable silhouette with padding, but that doesn't really work for this 1840s era where the silhouette is still very naturalistic and the corset is doing more smoothing and supporting than shaping. I mean, what was I supposed to do? Just wrap myself in a layer of wadding to protect my sticky out ribs from being rubbed raw by a metal busk? I knew this was going to be a long and involved process, but there was no getting around it. I needed some sort of corset, or the weight of the skirts for this era was going to bring me to my knees, and also give me a lot of pain anyway, so I had to find a way to make it work. So to begin with, I thought I'd try a slightly unconventional method. I'd made this duct tape dress form a few years ago in the hope it would help me fit my unusual proportions, and it did sort of, but I haven't really used it that much. But for this corset project, I saw an opportunity to try this second skin pattern cutting method popular with cosplayers for making armor and things. You can do it straight on your body, but as I had the dress form, I thought it would be easier and less painful for me to do it this way. You cover the dress form in cling film and then masking tape, and then draw in the lines of the pattern pieces you need directly on the tape. I used a pattern from Nora War's Corsets and Crinolines as a guide, and then cut the masking tape off the dress form and transferred it to paper to make a pattern. For reference, these are the two side pieces and you can see just how asymmetrical they are. No wonder I have so many issues trying to get this kind of garment to fit. I'd seen this tip from other costumers to make lacing strips to make corset fittings easier, but I didn't really have the time to do that, so instead I just harvested the back of an old corset mock-up, which worked just as well. And then I began making the first of many toiles. I made all my toiles from Calico, known elsewhere in the world as muslin. I took a very rough and ready approach for the first mock-up because I really wasn't confident that this method was going to work. Another tip I'd picked up from others on YouTube was to just masking tape the bones in rather than sew in boning channels. Corsets are really boring to sew because it's a lot of straight lines, so this made it much more bearable. And well, my concerns about this method not working turned out to be justified. It was much too big, the top line was much too low, and well, rather than working with my wonky body, it just didn't sit right. You can see with the lines, the red line is the centre of my pelvis and the yellow line is the centre of my neck. As you look at me, I curve to the right, But the corset is leaning to the left, so the top of the bust didn't sit in the centre of my bust and instead cut into my boobs. I tried to fiddle with it to get it to sit right, but no joy. I also wish to point out I took great care to make sure I didn't reverse any of the panels, and I'm sure I didn't, so it's not like I've got it on backwards. I have no idea what happened here, truly. Well, I think it's safe to say that didn't really work. And now that leaves me with quite a big dilemma because I don't know whether to try and work with what I already have in that frankly disastrous mock-up. I mean, it's so off and it's just so big. It also just looks shit. It just doesn't create any sort of pleasing line, and that's because it follows the lines of my body. So I think it was worthwhile doing this. And one of the things somebody asked me once on one of my live streams about accommodating asymmetry and what to do to accommodate asymmetry. And the reality is, if you make asymmetrical garments for an asymmetrical body, you highlight the asymmetry. And I don't want to do that. The point of a corset is to achieve that fashionable silhouette. And so while, yes, that mock-up was very comfortable to wear, it was partly because it was so big, which is weird because that duct tape dress form, firstly, when you make a duct tape dress form, you squish everything down anyway. But also, I was slimmer then when I made it than I am now. So I really don't understand how I've ended up with it being so big. And I also left a 2-inch gap down the back, and I'm able to close the mock-up entirely. I have ordered a book about corsetry, a different one, not just Nora War, a more modern one, in the hope that that might help, but it's not going to be here for a little while, and I am now really pressed for time because I've got like 10 weeks left and I have 2 dresses and several petticoats to make still, and I can't start on the dresses or the petticoats until I have the corset. So it needs to be done. So what I think I'm going to do, I've got this dress form here, which I very rarely use, or haven't since I made my duct tape one. It's been a long time since I've done any draping, and I should probably practice. So I think I'm going to drape a very basic 1830s, 1840s style corset, 2 panels and gauze. And I also am thinking that possibly if I make the panels symmetrical, I can make the gauze asymmetrical, and that will account for my asymmetry, but it won't be as obvious as having a off great diagonal line down the front of my corset, which was happening with that mock-up. Yeah, so I think that's what I'm going to do. This mannequin is much smaller than me despite her padding, so I also think that will help with the whole negative ease situation. And this mannequin is not ideal because it's very light, because it's polystyrene, and it doesn't hold the pins in the same way that a proper one does. But I think at this point I need something. I need something to wear that is going to create a smooth shape so that I can drape my dresses over it. I just need something. I need to make something quickly. And I'm sort of feeling like this is probably the most achievable option now. Part of the reason I don't drape very often, of course, is it involves standing up. So with that excellent start, I began draping a pattern on the stand. The technique here is very similar to the masking tape version, only rather than using tape, you use fabric. So I smooth fabric over the mannequin as best I can, draw in the lines of my design, and then trim the excess fabric away. Those fabric pieces then become a paper pattern, but I still needed some guidance for where to place the boning channels. I decided at this point that I didn't want to make the kind of smooth, high-end corsets that so often survive in museum collections. I wanted the rough and ready, homemade kind, because let's face it, that was more achievable for me at this moment. The book I ordered was Corsets by Jill Salen, which focuses on these more working class garments, and in the meantime, I turned to Pinterest for inspiration. I came across an example in the Manchester Art Gallery. I can't license the images, so there will be a link in the description so you can take a look yourself. But this was a very well-used corset that had repairs and alterations and was much more what I was looking for. So I started on toile number 2, this time sewing in the boning channels as well to test their locations, seeing as I had totally free-handed them based on some grainy pictures on my phone. This second mock-up was better, but still not great. It was too long in the body, which meant it cut in very uncomfortably over the hips, and I had to pinch out loads at the bust. I don't think I'd appreciated how much of the Victorian silhouette comes from having a large cup size. When I scaled up the proportions of original corsets, the bust was always way too big on me, and when I altered it to fit, I lost a lot of that classic hourglass shape. I didn't think to use bust padding for the 1840s era, but with hindsight, maybe I should have. But still, even wearing it for just a few minutes for a fitting, this corset was just too painful to bear. With toile number 2 still not taking me any closer to a finished garment, I had to have a rethink. While looking at the museum description of the black corset I'd been using for inspiration, I came across a particular line. Fronts each in one piece, shaped to the bust by 2 gussets, 2 vertical and 2 diagonal bones, remainder quilted. What I had been assuming was cording or boning channels was actually quilting. Now, I knew about 18th century jumps, but I didn't know that this technique had continued into the 19th century in corsetry. And when my copy of Jill Salin's book arrived, sure enough, there was another example of quilting, alongside cording and boning, being used to shape corsets. This led me down an entire rabbit hole researching quilted corsets, and I even found a few costumers I know who've made one. Could this be my solution? Could the answer to my cheese grater rib situation be literally wrapping myself in a layer of wadding? Only one way to find out! I went to my local quilt shop to buy a lightweight cotton quilt batting. I knew I wanted cotton for breathability, all those layers are hot, I have issues with temperature regulation, it needed to be a natural fibre. I tweaked my pattern based on the previous not so successful fitting and cut my next mock-up with a layer of wadding sandwiched between 2 layers of calico. Then began the long process of quilting the pieces together. I don't think I've ever actually done any quilting. This might have been my very first go at it. It was mostly just sewing straight lines, and calico isn't particularly shifty, so it went okay. I deliberately left the wadding larger than the pieces just in case. I then could join all the pieces together. I'd made these little quilted sections to turn into gussets that I just ended up tacking in place for the fitting. I didn't bother about finishing any raw edges because this was still just a toile, and I had no idea if this was going to work at all. I'm very sorry, I can't find my external microphone anywhere. So, I mean, this room is a mess because of corset fitting. So, it'll be here somewhere. But I finally have a corset mock-up that I'm happy to share with you. So, this is 2 layers of calico and a layer of cotton quilt batting. You'll probably see that at the centre front here. And this is based on several things. It's a mashup of various different bits and pieces, but as you can see, I've managed to get something that looks quite straight and even. So I thought I'd talk you through what I've done to make that happen and the alterations I am going to make before I cut it out in the final fabric. So my main issue when I wear a corset is the fact that my rib cage is very prominent, and it's also, you can't really see, it's sort of like rotated around so that one half sticks out, actually it's this half, sticks out more than the other. So like originally, I don't know if you can see, I had boning channels down and over the bust, and that firstly was doing weird things because I've only got flat steel bones. It wasn't working, but also it was just, after any period of time, the ribs that poke out more than they should here, it was just like cheese gratering them. So what I decided to do was actually take out those bones. I might put in some cording and see if that helps. And I've got a bone along this diagonal seam instead. As you can see, it's rolling a bit. So I think that's because the boning channel is too wide. I'm also going to put a spiral steel bone in there. I do have some spiral steel, but I'm saving it for the real deal because that shit's expensive. And then part of the way I've managed to get this to look more even from the front, I mean, it's still not ideal, is I've put the hip, only one hip gusset in at the back. So I've got a nice, gently shaped panel, very, very gently shaped panel at the front, and then all the shaping is happening at the back. And I don't know if it's uneven or not, it probably is, because I just sort of pinned it and hoped, as we do when we're fitting the back of things on ourselves. The top edge and the bottom edge are probably still a touch long. What I hadn't anticipated would be such an issue is the fact that I am so short-waisted and just generally short, even when sort of using existing corsets from the period as reference, I would sort of draw out the length they were supposed to be, and I'd be like, this is long. Penciled in some lines. I have no idea if you can see them. So I think that's where I'm going to bring the top of my corset down to. And then the bottom is just probably about 2 centimetres maybe up, and then angling up over the hip. And that will hopefully give me a bit more room to move. That does mean that I won't get quite as much of that 1840 shape. I mean, I could leave it longer. I've got plenty of room to move. I might leave it longer for a more 1840s shape. Will I be able to walk and sit down though is my issue. Like I say, this here, having pressure here on me is just really uncomfortable, and it always is going to be. So even like this, having the bust here is starting to pinch, but there's not really anything I can do about that. So I think what I'm going to do to compensate for that is I'm going to, it's still a bit big in the bust. Hang on, let me show you on the pattern piece. So I think what I'm going to do is I have got, this is this line here, and it's quite a diagonal angle. So I think I'm just going to straighten that out a bit. So I'm going to put in more width here and take some out here. And then hopefully that will bring this in and let this out ever so slightly. So I've got a little bit more room to play with here. Told you about putting the hip gussets in the back so that if they are wonky, nobody can see it from the front. Also, I've deliberately just made it loose. I've deliberately put in a very wide lacing gap. I mean, I can lace it much tighter than this, not that I'd want to because it's already pinching. But I thought, well, what's the point of, you see them in period with a very wide lacing gap. And I know that having the bones over the most tender bits of my spine is just going to be agony. So why would I do that to myself just for the sake of like a convention, which is you must have a 2-inch lacing gap. You don't need a 2-inch lacing gap to have whatever size lacing gap you like. Who cares? As long as it doesn't hurt you, it'll be fine. You can see still I am getting a little bit of creasing around here, and I honestly just don't know how to avoid that. I had a similar thing on when I made that Edwardian style dress. It just creases in. I think because my rib cage is so wide and offset, and then suddenly my sort of squishy bit happens and everything drops off. It's like, oh, okay, so I've got tension up here and then nothing here. And so unless I make a very sort of weirdly shaped pattern piece, which literally just sort of comes in dramatically, I don't think I'm going to be able to eliminate those wrinkles. I've also brought my hip gussets right the way up to the waistline. They're often a bit lower than that on corsets in this period, but I need the shaping. Like I say, I'm very short-waisted. There isn't even an inch worth of waist on me to put in an inch waistband, we have discovered, or an inch waist tape. So I need those hip gussets higher to create the shape sooner. This is the thing. It's a balance between making something comfortable and creating a silhouette, the correct silhouette or whatever. Because 1840s corsets tend to have a very low waist because that was the fashion, was quite tubular and conical still. But why would I do that to myself? I don't really care. So I think what I'm going to do is when I cut my bodices, I'm going to cut them with that sort of V shape to sort of fake a long waist. And if they start up here, oh well, frankly. Part of me is tempted to just bind this and deal with this as is and put a buskin, put the proper bones in, all that sort of stuff, and just go with this and not bother making a sort of final version and turning this into like a wearable mock-up or whatever. Because I am really short of time, and why am I making a corset for this event? Well, I'm making it to get a nice smooth line, which I think I've achieved, and also primarily to help distribute the weight of the dress and the petticoats, because I know from making and wearing Little Dorrit, all that kit is just so heavy, and just the increased weight on my body, if you like, so exhausting. Thankfully, I've bought real silk this time, so whereas that was cotton sateen, so it was really heavy, and so hopefully the real silk will be lighter and less exhausting. I'm also looking into lightweight petticoat options like organdy and things rather than a corded petticoat. Yeah, still, that was the primary reason why I wanted a structured undergarment, is to help distribute the weight of the dress. So I really don't care what it looks like. So how lazy? Well, no, not lazy, that's not the word. How much do I want to prioritise the dresses over the corset? I want to prioritise the dresses. I don't think I'm going to make it. I think I'm just going to finish this. I really don't think I care. I actually think I'm just going to finish this. Literally, the gussets are zigzagged in. Like, all the raw edges, everything. I really don't care. It's just a means to an end. This can be good, and then we'll have better and best options where if I have time before the ball, I've got the pattern, I know the alterations I want to make, I'll make the corset. But at least I'll have something this way. And I can sort of put this entire frustrating, soul-destroying process to bed, get started on the fun stuff.
So then I started the process of making this mock-up more like a finished garment. I trimmed down the excess inside and then began making those slight alterations I talked about, taking in the bust and letting out the waist ever so slightly. I didn't have a lot of seam allowance to play with, so I really did let it out a very tiny amount. Then I trimmed down the top and bottom edges, lining up both sides of the corset as best as I could so that they matched roughly. Now that I had the pieces of the corset dismantled again, I began adding more cording and quilting lines to give a bit more structure to the corset. I mostly eyeballed these using the width of my presser foot as a guide and made them just about big enough to fit the width of cord that I had in my stash through them. For the gusset panels, I just zigzagged over the raw edges to hold the bulk in place and to prevent fraying. Not pretty by any means, but quick and secure. I then threaded cord through the channels I had just sewn using one of these long needles used for doll making. This was really difficult to do and I wouldn't attempt this method again, but because of the way I had already quilted the panels, it was my only option. Some of the channels I had sewn were too big for the cord, so I got out my zipper foot and just did another line of stitching to make them fit better. I then tore up an old toile to make a facing piece for the busk and began marking out the gaps I needed to leave in the seam for busk holes to poke through. At this point, you can really see how much I care about the appearance of this garment because I'm just using biro for this. I then carefully sewed along the centre front seam, leaving gaps where all those hooks needed to poke through, reversing every time I stop and start. I trimmed away that little bit of wadding in the seam allowance to reduce bulk. The seam gets pressed and then the busk is poked through all those holes, which is fiddly and is like trying to play a game of whack-a-mole or something. They keep popping out just as you get the other end in place, but eventually I was able to get it to fit. This then gets stitched with a presser foot as close to the busk as possible so it fits really tightly. This was fiddly and cumbersome to do because you're fighting the very rigid metal of the busk, but it was easier to do it with the panels apart than it would have been attached to the rest of the corset. I wasn't satisfied with my first attempt, so again, I just did another line of stitching once it was sort of tacked in place to be more precise. Then lining everything up to the other side, I marked where the post holes needed to go to correspond to the hooks on the other side. I did use pencil for this because it would have been more visible. I used an awl to poke the holes where the little posts will sit, but then I installed the other half of the busk in basically the same way. I realised at this moment I'd forgotten to do a little bit of quilting at the waistline, so I did that before moving on to installing the eyelets. And they are eyelets in this case because I didn't have anything else, and they were also incredibly small. But I didn't want to buy anything, so I just used what I had and hammered them in place on my garden step using a vintage eyelet tool I had in my stash that wasn't actually designed to use with these eyelets, but it worked. This is easily going to be the worst thing I have ever made. Easily. This corset. I'm such a fool. Because I'm just not interested, I'm not enjoying myself. I'm just not, my head just isn't in it. And so I set all these eyelets in, and I think I did quite a good job actually. I mean, they're probably too small, but they're what I had. They're also eyelets, not grommets, so they probably won't last. Oh well. If I was going to use eyelets this small, I probably should have spaced them closer together, which I haven't done. Oh well. However, what you might notice is the glaring mistake I've made, which is that I've set the eyelets before I've finished the raw edge. So what I should have done is made a facing and stitched the facing down like I did when I put in the busk. That's better, now you can see it. I should have done that for the centre back as well. But I didn't. And actually, when I look at it, because of the quilting, I don't think the eyelets that I have would have gone through another layer of fabric. So I'm going to have to do something else. I think I'm just going to bind it. Really don't care at this point. Who cares? I need a corset. I need to get this done because it's dragging on and on and on, and it's cutting into my making time for the things I'm actually excited about. I also noticed, despite trying to cut these evenly, one is much longer than the other.
And when I matched them up at the other end, it's so bad. Like, look, it's completely off at that end as well, but in the opposite direction. I guess this is a lesson in compromising on your standards. Not everything needs to be perfect. I will come back to this at some point when I'm not on a deadline, not in a rush, when I'm motivated to work on it, when I can, I don't know, have somebody help me with fittings, I'm not trying to do all this on my own, when I'm feeling a bit more positive about my body. For now, it'll do. It's good enough. Let's see if I can't find some pre-made binding because I don't want to have to cut my own. I did indeed find some pre-made bias tape, and I decided to finish all the raw edges with it, including the ones that would be on the side seam rather than do a flat felled seam, but because it was quicker. I finished the edges of the side seam before sewing it together, just made everything much neater and easier. I also decided at this point I wanted an extra boning channel in the back piece, but I couldn't quilt it, so I just stitched some cotton tape on the inside to make an internal boning channel. I then bound the bottom edge of the corset, ready to insert the steels. This was an incredibly fiddly process and not one I recommend if you have fine motor issues like me. Getting those caps to stay on the spiral steels was a nightmare. Just buy steels that are the correct length to begin with. The flat steels were the worst, it was so difficult to cut them, and then I had to file them down using my dad's Dremel, which he kindly lent me. Thanks, Dad. And I actually still ended up covering the ends of the bones with masking tape because I didn't have any caps that would fit them to stop them poking through. But with the bones in place, all that remained was to bind the top edge of the corset, which I did in exactly the same way as the bottom, and then it was finally done. Well, here it is, officially the worst thing I have ever made. Actually, I don't really think it's that bad. All things considered, I do think I was able to get something that looks alright. If I do ever get around to making a final version, I think it will be a pretty solid attempt at a corset. I think to say how rough and ready all these undergarments were, from a distance they definitely do the job and look the part. I'm still not sure about this whole open crotch situation. A lot of people have recommended I wear the chemise loose over the bloomers instead, and I think I will try that next time because this weird bubble butt situation is not ideal. On close inspection, it doesn't look too wonky, but you can also see a lot more of the questionable construction. But I do really like the shape it creates. I don't know why the chemise puff sleeves and the bloomers, it's almost giving 1950s peasant blouse and capri pants. I don't know, I felt cute. Still, after all this work, I stand by what I said. It really fucking hurts. I still believe that corsets are evil, and I shall further demonstrate why in my wheelchair. There's no way to sit comfortably and not have the bottom of the bust poke in a really uncomfortable place. Victorian ladies would often perch on the edge of a chair like this, which helps, but that's not a safe or convenient position to use a wheelchair in. You also have to have your legs up off the floor, which makes it dig in even more. Similarly, when you sit down, naturally the flesh of your backside is pushed up, right into the bottom edge of the corset where you have the bones at the centre back. Here I tried to smooth my body away from the edge of the corset, but the only thing I found to be effective was scooching forward a bit, so I was at more of an angle, which meant trying to propel my chair in this awkward reclined angle, which was really uncomfortable for my neck and shoulders. You also frequently in a self-propelled wheelchair need to bend at the waist to get enough momentum to power forward over difficult terrain or uphill. But the front busk really restricts the range of motion you have here, so it's just so much more effort. Similarly, the top edge rubs across the shoulder blades as you move your arms to propel forward. I don't know if this is just me because my shoulder blades stick out more because of my scoliosis, but it's just not a pleasant feeling. So I don't know if I will ever find a workable solution to all my many issues when it comes to corsetry. Maybe I just have to accept that it's just never going to be for me and I should focus my costuming on other non-corseted eras. But look at that look, it's such a cute look. Oh. Anyway, that's it. This video took forever, much like the corset, and my overwhelming feeling is relief that I actually managed to do it. Thanks for watching. See you next time. So today, I have to make petticoats. It's one of my least favourite jobs. It's so repetitive and it's a kind of a necessary evil. Unfortunately, I can't use the one I made for Little Dorrit because that was a bodiced petticoat and it's that empire waist style, so I have to do it all over again. But with the corset finished, I'm so close to moving on to the bits I'm excited about, so I'm just gonna bash out some really simple petticoats. I'm just gonna make it as easy as I can on myself. We're not gonna do any ruffles, probably not gonna do any tucks. They're just gonna be rectangles gathered onto a waistband. I have also asked for recommendations in a Facebook group I'm a part of about reducing weight and bulk, because that was one of the things I really struggled with my Little Dorrit costume, was just the weight of it. It made me feel like I was wading through treacle the whole time. Something that they unanimously suggested was to make the petticoats out of organdy. So I have bought myself some organdy and it is literally, it's like paper. So I'm going to make 2 petticoats. I'm going to make an organdy petticoat, which is sort of going to be my structural layer, and I might put a ruffle on the bottom of that one to help with the shape. Maybe not. Who knows if that's necessary. It might not ruffle down nicely either, so I might have to pleat it onto a waistband. It might not gather down, that's what I mean, sorry. So I'll have to pleat that onto a waistband. And then what I've done for sort of my ordinary cotton petticoat, I've bought, oh I should probably pre-wash this. But what I've done is I've bought extra wide cotton sheeting, so I can hopefully just cut a length, sew it into a tube and gather it down and we'll have a petticoat. And maybe if I'm feeling fancy I might put some tucks at the bottom or some lace or something, but I'm making this as easy as possible on myself because I'm running out of time, I'm running out of energy, and I'm running out of enthusiasm for this project right now. I have to be honest, if I don't start working with my nice silk soon, I think I might cry. I started by measuring approximately how long I wanted my petticoats to be. I knew I didn't want them to be to the floor, and doing this on yourself is difficult, so I mostly just guessed. I then measured the width of the organdy to see how many panels I would need. I decided that 3 would be enough to get the volume I wanted, and then I measured out that length I just measured on myself, and tore the organdy into 3 panels roughly that long. I then changed my machine needle because this organdy is very delicate and the needle was starting to get a bit blunt from sewing through all the layers of the corset I'd just made. And then I sewed all those organdy panels into a tube. I left an opening in one seam to act as a placket so I could get the petticoat on, but mostly I just bashed these straight seams through the machine as fast as possible. I then noticed one of my panels was a lot longer than one of the others. I must have not been paying attention when I measured it, so I just ripped a bit off. I can probably just crease it with my fingers, can't I? I mean, we'll give it a press anyway for good measure, but... I pressed the seams open and then began hemming the petticoat. The crisp, papery nature of the organdy definitely made this process easier. I folded it up once and pressed it in place all the way around, and then folded and pressed it again. This is my preferred way to do this, especially for deeper hems like this. The deeper hem would help the bottom edge of the petticoat stand out and create more volume. And then I just machined the hem in place. I lined everything up nicely so that the top stitching wasn't too ugly, but yeah, I again just bashed it through the machine. I then had a bit of a disaster. This papery fabric tore so easily that when I went to fold back the seam allowance of the placket section, it just tore right along the selvage. So I did a very basic mend with a zigzag stitch on the machine, just butting the two torn edges up against each other and zigzagging along the tear. Not at all pretty or even that strong, but it worked. Then I made a waistband. For this, I used waistband Petersham and I just wrapped a bit around my waist with a generous amount of overlap, once a theatre costumer, always a theatre costumer, and cut it to length. I then set up that length of Petersham to become a waistband. I started by neatening the raw edges by folding them under and zigzagging them in place. Then I found the centre of the waistband by folding it in half, made a crease at that point and stitched a line to act as a centre mark. I then measured half of my waist measurement with my corset on, away from that centre line. I'm using the markings on the front of my sewing machine here to do this quickly. Again, creased that point in place and marked it with stitching. I then matched those two lines of stitching up to find the midpoint between them, creased and stitched that. What I've done here is easily quarter my waistband, taking into account the overlap, no maths needed. I then transferred those marks to the other half of the waistband, again with the creasing and stitching, and this will make pleating this petticoat so much easier. This also works great for gathering and is absolutely the most efficient way to make any kind of period skirt, and I should know because I've probably made hundreds of these things in my lifetime. I then marked the centre front and the quarter points of the petticoat, this time using pins, and then started pleating the organdy onto the waistband by matching the centre front points. I'm not covering the Petersham in anything because that will add bulk, which I don't want. I'm just going to sew the organdy directly onto the Petersham. This is completely historically accurate. We even see this technique on outerwear skirts too. I kept a 3-inch section at the centre front flat without any pleats. This is the fashion for skirts generally in the 1840s because you have that long point of the bodice in that area, so you don't need any volume. I then matched the quarter. God, I'd forgotten that wrestling with this stiff fabric was a nightmare. But anyway, I matched the quarter points and then that tells me how much fabric I have to pleat into the front quarter of the waistband. I then spent a really long time pinning the pleats into position. This took several attempts because I didn't measure anything or do any maths, I just eyeballed it. I knew I wanted the pleats to be roughly an inch wide and I used my gridded cutting mat as a guide, but I didn't know how many pleats I needed or how much fabric I'd have to lose in each one. I just moved them about until it worked roughly and had an uneven pleat with whatever fabric I had left at the side. I then spent a very long time machining these pleats in place with a zigzag stitch. I'm going over the raw edge here so that I'm getting a really flat join and also stopping the organdy from fraying. I went really slowly to make sure nothing slipped or got tucked up in a weird way, and it was probably the most careful I was on this project. And then once those pleats were sewn, we had our first petticoat. I was thrilled with how light and yet rigid it was. On to the next one. So the same thing again, tearing off a length that matched my measurements and sewing it into a tube with an opening at the top. For the hem this time, I didn't even do any measuring or pressing, I just rolled it as I went. And then I gathered it down onto a waistband and zigzagged in place, only this time I used cotton tape instead of Petersham, and well, it wasn't as successful. So I have a problem. The organdy petticoat worked fine, looks great. I'm just waiting to put a hook and eye on the waistband until I try on my corset and the whole shaboodle. The other, cotton sheeting one, hasn't been so successful. I just did what I did before, but instead of using Petersham, I used cotton tape, and the plan was I was going to just tie it. However, there is so much volume in this skirt that it doesn't gather down densely enough to reach my waist measurement. And also, as soon as I went to put it on, all the gathers ripped out because the cotton tape stretches and the gathering stitches didn't. So this was a fail. It's also still really quite heavy, and I don't know, I'd really kind of dreamed of having a lovely big fluffy petticoat, and I'm just not sure whether that's going to be a reality for me that can happen just with the weight of it. And there's no ruffles, there's no starch or anything. It's also too long. I mean, 180 inches is massive for a petticoat of this era. It's massive for a petticoat of anything that isn't like 1860s. But part of the reason I wanted to make it so big was so that I could use it across eras. That's what we do here. But I don't know whether, I don't know what to do basically. I don't have any more plain white fabric to play with. So I either have to take this apart and cut it up and have less volume, or I really don't want to cartridge pleat it, but that might be the best option. Should I leave this one for now and just order new fabric, lighter fabric, voile or something to make a fluffy petticoat? That means I can't do anything today and I'm running out of time. I don't know what to do. I've had a brainwave. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hem this to be considerably shorter than I need it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a really wide shaped, almost yoke for the top of the skirt so that it sits snugly over the hips, and then the bottom edge should be bigger and then the fabric should gather down at that point, because I don't really want the excess volume. Oh no, I do, for that bell shape. Oh shit. But I suppose the bodice is quite long. Maybe if I make it with a point at the front? I have some experimenting to do. So I started version 2 by ripping off that failed cotton tape waistband and re-hemming the petticoat in exactly the same way as the organdy one. I didn't unpick my previous hem, I just left that as a double fold. It was a bit bulky, but oh well. When I machined it in place, I deliberately used a tacking stitch because I knew this was a bit of a guess and I might have to lengthen or shorten the hem later. I then got all corseted up to create the pieces for the yoke. The plan was to just drape this directly on my body, and I was using offcuts from my bloomers before I realised I should probably wear my organdy petticoat too. I roughly pinned the bits of cotton in place, there's a back piece going on here too, and then pinned in the shape of the yoke I wanted. I wanted it to be very narrow at the side, but follow the lines of the corset at the front. I only pinned in one half, so I simply folded the fabric in half, chalked on the pin line, and then, adding seam allowance as I went, cut through both layers of fabric. For the back, I drafted a very quick and dirty curved waistband in a similar way, pinned the whole thing together and tried it back on. It was much too big, so I brought it in at the seams and pinched out a chunk at the centre back that would act as the opening and the underlap. I then started the process of turning those rough bits of fabric into the final pattern pieces. This involved trimming down the centre back for the opening and cutting a matching lining, chalking on all the sewing lines and notches, and then pinning the backs to the fronts at the side seam for main and lining before sewing those pieces together. Then with right sides together, I matched the side seams of main and lining up and began pinning the two together along the top edge. This then gets stitched in place, starting with the short end of the waistband that will form the underlap at the back. I reversed as I got to the corner for strength, and I rounded off the point slightly so that it's easier to get a sharp corner when I turn it right sides out. I then pivoted and reversed again before sewing along the sewing line I chalked in along the top edge. When I got to the other end of the waistband, it was the same thing again, reversing, pivoting and reinforcing the corner before stitching the short end. Once sewn, I notched the curved sections at the back to reduce bulk once I turned the yoke right sides out. I could then start pressing the seam along the top of the yoke into position. I started by pressing the seam allowances towards the lining over my tailor's ham to get right into that curved section. I could then fold the waistband in half crisply along the seam and press it flat. I did a little fussing with the corners to get them really sharp and made sure the seam allowances were lying nice and flat in there. I then sewed long gathering stitches into just the back sections of the petticoat. I knew I wanted to pleat the front instead. I was quickly running out of white thread at this point, so I used whatever colours I had lying around. I then gathered the back sections down and pinned and machined them to one layer of the yoke, waistband, whatever I'm calling it, starting at the side seam and finishing at the centre back, leaving the very end clear for the overlapping section. I left the gathering stitches in place for now, tying off the threads to keep the tension in place. I then pleated down the front, clipped it in place and basted over the pleats. I'm not attaching them to the yoke here, I'd just already sewn the yoke onto the back panels, and it actually would have been a lot easier to do the front first, but I didn't think of that, so now I had to wrestle this through the machine. In the end, I had to cut the yoke off again because doing the back before the front turned out to be a huge mistake. There was so much fabric to get into such a small space, I ended up using a pleating pattern more common in the 1850s and 60s of doing double box pleats. Again, I did this very roughly by eye. I made the top visible layer nice and even and then just hid whatever fabric I had left in the pleats that wouldn't be seen. Then I went upstairs to my sit-down, big ironing board to set up to press the pleats into position so I could reattach the yoke. This took a lot of fussing to get them smooth, and I haven't used this iron in so long that it took me a really long time to remember how to get it to steam, and then it spewed chalk all over my fabric. It was okay, everything survived. I then pressed the pleats in place really firmly. I wanted them to be really crisp, and it was at this moment I realised I should have brought my clapper up. But what I did instead was just let the pleats cool and then tacked them in place with long diagonal stitches and then repeat for all the other pleats. I then pressed under the seam allowance on my yoke, easing the curves in place and shrinking any excess with the steam. I then had to add the yoke from the right side, so this folded under edge was matched to the sewing line on top of the gathered sections and then carefully pinned in place. The reason I had to take this approach was because I needed to know where to sew the diagonal edges of the yoke over the tacked down pleats. I smoothed everything to keep the top edge of the petticoat level as I did this so that the front wouldn't end up shorter than the back. For the second half of the front, I had to be careful that I kept the point of the yoke exactly at the centre front, but this diagonal edge ended up a bit longer. Maybe I stretched it, or let's face it, I just wasn't very precise with my cutting, but I ended up being able to shrink the excess out with some steam and then ease in the fullness with lots of careful pinning. And then the prospect of trying to get this heavy, now very spiky seam through the sewing machine didn't feel like something I was down for, so I tacked it in place. It takes longer, but it's more secure and more likely to be a success the first time around, so it was worth it. At this point, this was all the white thread I had left, so I had to get this right. I was so glad I had tacked this in place, it made everything so much simpler. I'm just top stitching the yoke on. I didn't use a top stitching foot because I find if I need to sew to the right of the guide, I can't really see what I'm doing, so I used my ordinary foot and just took things slow. I pivoted at the point at the front to get a nice finish. I know top stitching isn't accurate for this era, but if I was going to do it, I wanted it to be neat, especially at the front. I then very carefully trimmed away the excess fabric of the pleats that would sit inside the yoke. This was quite a heart-wrenching moment because having spent all that time ironing and tacking, if I had to redo it, I would have been mad. But I managed, it was fine. I could then fold the yoke lining into position, turning under the raw edge to match the sewing line and pinning it in position. This was one of those things I probably should have gone back up to the ironing board and pressed everything to get it super smooth and accurate, but I didn't. I chose having wrinkles and being done sooner over a smooth finish on the inside because, well, it's the inside, no one's going to see it. It was a bit trickier to manage this around the curves of the back section, but with a bit more smoothing and patience I got there. As I was so short of thread at this point, that meant I couldn't do a sink stitch or a top stitch, I had to hand stitch. I didn't mind so much because, I mean, this is a historical project. Part of the appeal is hand sewing, and I'm also pretty quick at this sort of thing, so it was nice to end on something a bit more refined than just bashing these things together. I also removed as much of the gathering threads as I had the patience for before giving up where it was too tricky and decided to just come back to it when I had more time. And then finally, the petticoats were finished. All in all, I was able to make these petticoats over 3 days, which is pretty quick for me. I'm really pleased with how they turned out and the volume and the shape I was able to get without adding too much weight. You might notice I didn't add any fastenings. This was sort of deliberate. It was one of those, oh, I'll come back to it when I know more about how tight I want them to fit, but I just never did. I went to the ball with them just safety pinned shut, and that worked really well because it allowed me to decide how tight I wanted my corset on the day, and I knew everything would still fit. The bigger over petticoat is too short. Maybe one day I'll make it better by re-hemming it or adding a ruffle or flounce, but it was fine for the ball. In fact, it probably stopped me tripping, so I called it good. If this reveal is a little manic in atmosphere, that was because I was really losing the will to live at this point and I still had 2 dresses to make. But it was finally time to get to work on the important bit, the ball gown. Thanks for watching, see you next time. So, all the undergarments are complete with the exception of maybe a bustle, but we'll see if we need it. I'm hoping I won't need one, because the idea of putting more stuff around my waist is not exciting to me at the moment. But it's time to finally start working on the dress. So, I have some options. I could drape a pattern. It would probably be quicker to drape a pattern, but that involves standing up. So what we're going to do instead is I'm using this book. This is Creating Historical Clothes by Elizabeth Friendship. I really like this book. If you are familiar with flat pattern cutting, sort of in the style of the Closet Historian, this is a pattern cutting book for historical styles. So it tells you how to take a bodice block and move the seams around and everything so that you get all sorts of things from the 1500s to the 1900s. It's quite generic, so it's not got every style you're going to want, and annoyingly it does end at like the end of the 19th century, so there's no Edwardian styles in here. Yeah, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to draft a basic block. See, I've got nerve pain now, my shoulder blade is tingling from wearing this stupid thing. But yeah, I'm going to draft their basic bodice block, and then I'm going to alter it to be, what do they call it? It's like bodice with dropped shoulder and shortened back neckline. It's page 190. If you do have a copy of this book, there'll be a link in the description if you want one. So basically you shorten the neckline and you drop the shoulder and you've got an 1840s bodice. I started by taking all the measurements I would need to draft the pattern over all my undergarments. See, that's why I was so desperate to get all the underwear made. I did the usual bust, waist and hips in both centimetres and inches because I couldn't remember which system this author used. But to draft a pattern you always need some more specific ones, and these depend on the instructions you are using. I needed a measurement from armpit to armpit across the front and from bust apex to bust apex, also known as nipple to nipple. There were a few more like neck to shoulder and bicep to draft the sleeve. Measuring nape to waist on your own back can be a pain, but I find having one of these retractable tape measures helps because it acts a bit like a plumb line to keep the tape measure straight. So I've got my paper, my ruler, my pencil, what do Americans call this? Eraser. So she recommends here, Elizabeth, use the measurement charts on pages 10 to 11. So they're telling you to sort of find your ready to wear size, but naturally I don't match any of their sizes. I'm like, some measurements I'm a 12, some I'm a 16, some I'm a 14. So we'll just wing it, I think. So sheet of paper, half bust measurement, measurement 1 plus 1 inch, times nape to waist measurement plus 5 inches. Nape to waist measurement, which for me was 41. Oh, that's good. Half measurement 3. Definitely looking at the wrong thing. That's 7. Okay, so I've drafted the pattern. I haven't finished exactly the pattern as given in the instructions because I don't want it to be just a basic bodice block. I want it to be this 1840s one, and then I'm going to adjust it to be a variation, low neck variation, all that sort of thing. So what I have to do is I have to raise the bust point. So that means I have to re-angle the line of this dart slightly. I can get rid of that line. And then I'm going to follow directions here. I have to shorten the back neck from a measure A to B back neck width minus 1.5 centimeters according to size. Huh? Minus 1.5 to 3 centimeters according to size. What, my size? Or do you give me guidelines? Oh, I'm going to have to take this corset off because my shoulder is tingling. It was at this stage that I began to run into a few more issues with the pattern instructions. I don't know if I just misunderstood them or if there was something missing, but I basically followed my instincts to move the neckline in and the shoulder out and down for a dropped shoulder. Why are you still wearing this corset, Claudia? You could just take it off. I could just take it off, but I am trying to sort of get used to it, season it. I don't know. I'm just trying to hate it a little bit less. The front was also a bit weird, but the front shoulder seam was also extended down and out and then curved outwards. Then we go back to the back and drop it even further and curve that too. The next step was creating the style lines with dart manipulation and turning darts into panels. The instructions got particularly confusing at this point and I ended up mostly just doing my own thing. I did, however, end up with the pattern being a bit small, so I did a very simple slash and spread in the side pieces to get it to be more like my size. After my struggle with the instructions and the pattern ending up the wrong size, I wasn't feeling particularly confident, so the first toile was made from an old bedsheet. I like to cut my patterns without seam allowance, as I find it makes it much easier to do adjustments that way, but that does mean I have to chalk on all the seam allowances before I can cut anything out. It also gives me the freedom to add uneven seam allowances depending on which bits I'm confident will fit better than others. Here I'm pretty certain I'm more likely to adjust the seam positions, so I add more seam allowance there than I do around the armhole, which I'm pretty certain is in the right place. And then time to cut it out. You know it's a bad day when you need both hands to use the scissors. For a toile, it's really important to transfer all the markings, sewing lines and notches. I find the quickest, most energy efficient way to do this is to use carbon paper and a tracing wheel. I find that if I fold the carbon paper in half so that there is carbon facing out on both sides, I can slide the paper between the layers of my pattern pieces and the tracing wheel will mark both sides at once. It's fainter on one side than the other, but if you use a bright colour like red, it's still visible. With everything marked up, I can sew everything together. As we've got a lot of curved seams here, I used a lot of pins and was careful to match all the balance marks and ease the two curves in as I stitched. I also threw a zip very haphazardly into the centre back seams so that I could get this thing on and off by myself. The clip that holds the microphone in place has snapped and it's become a bloody nightmare, quite honestly. So, bodice mock-up. And actually, I think it's almost fine. It's not fine. There are things that need changing, but it's not drastically out. I took some photographs and some phone footage, so the wrinkles might show up a bit better there, but I'll sort of do a little turn for you, because of course, with it being white on white, it's kind of hard for you to see. I'm very happy with the seam placement. I didn't think I would be, but I've kind of got that 18th century stomacher vibes going on, or 17th century stomacher vibes, which is a bit more like this one is going to be. I've been helping Micah from Engineering Knits with the fitting of her ball gown bodice, and we had a big discussion about where these off the shoulder seams and like neckline is supposed to hit. because I have seen it basically in the fashion plates, you know, they draw them with these very sloping shoulders, so it looks like they're down here. So I was a little bit concerned about my shoulder seams, but I actually think they're going to be okay. But my issue is I have quite narrow shoulders, but they're very straight across. I don't slope at all, so I'm not very fashionable. But so I've got quite a sharp right angle, so it's very difficult for me to get anything to sort of sit on the roll of the shoulder. But the chemise underneath actually made a difference, and it's one of those things about when we talk about appropriate undergarments, we often talk about shapewear, right? But actually, when I tried this on before, just over like a vest top, a camisole, it didn't stay in place, but with the chemise underneath it does, because it's got like the resistance or whatever of the fabric. So again, appropriate undergarments, not just corsets and hoops and all of that. The one thing I think I am going to change, I like the way it fits over the bust, but I do have a wrinkle here, and they do put padding in them, so I will put padding in mine, but I just do have a little bit, it's just too much excess really. So conveniently, it forms itself into a dart that goes right to the bust point. So I'm just going to do some basic dart manipulation, pin a dart in, pivot it out into this seam. You can see I've got some wrinkling here under the bust, and I did contemplate whether I wanted to alter this seam, but I have so little wiggle room at the front here, and also, as you know, my prominent ribs make things difficult. And then of course I remembered you're supposed to bone the fronts of these bodices, and as well it will have a peplum and a skirt hanging off it, maybe not a skirt hanging off it, it depends. I kind of want to make this dress a little bit like I did with Little Dorrit. I want to make it modular so I can swap bits in and out if I need to. I can put you know, a different bodice, a day and evening bodice, and mix and match and all those sorts of things. But at this period they do tend to be attached rather than separate skirts and bodices. They tend to be actual dresses. So I'm probably going to have to do a little bit of sort of theatre magic rigging to get what I want to happen. I haven't shaped this side seam, it's just curved, and I think I actually need to fisheye it, and it needs to flare out more at the hip, which I hadn't anticipated because I've got quite a prominent spring now with my old set of stays on. So this side seam needs to open up more and allow more room for the hips, and then everything will hopefully sit a bit neater. Something funny, can you see that wrinkle there? I often get wrinkles there, but there's something funny happening with the armhole of this section, and it's not just because I haven't snipped it, I don't think. I think it's coming too high up too quickly. I can kind of feel the flesh of my arm there that it's straining against, and it's sort of, at first I thought maybe it's too long in that section, but I don't think it is. I think it's just too tight, and that's what's causing that wrinkling. And I could also potentially put a bone in the back if I want to. Don't know if I want to, but like, because you can see if I pull it down, I'm still getting creasing there, and I think it's just because of the tightness. And also you can kind of, like in the armpit there, yeah, it's too tight. So I need more room there. I'm quite happy with the neckline. It's coming to a V, which is making it a bit Sleeping Beauty? Sleeping Beauty. It's making it a bit Sleeping Beauty, and I don't want that. I want mine to be rounder. And I think that's just because I freehanded that curve in and I did it a kind of a shitty job. So I'm just going to round that out. I mean, I do quite like that little V. I think it's quite flattering with my my collarbones, but I'll chalk something else in and see how I feel. Also, the bottom edge is too short. It needs to be longer, and also I appreciate white on white, you can't see anything, but this moment here for me is too dramatic. I want a softer curve there. You can see here it's riding up because it's too tight, so it just needs to be let out a little bit from the waistline down. And I want this to sort of come more in a slightly less dramatic point. It's probably where with the seam allowance where it is, it's probably the length I want, but it's a very kind of concave shape and I want a bit of a straighter line. I think I need to look at my inspiration image again. Yeah, I want mine a bit straighter. And then I have to drape the peplum pieces, and I have this applied faux sort of stomacher thing to faff about with. I haven't done anything for sleeves yet, so I need to draft a sleeve pattern. It's a inspiration I'm using is not a gathered sleeve, it's just a straight sleeve. So that's less forgiving. I'm not working on that until I've corrected the shape of the armhole. But as far as first mock-ups go, to say how shittily I drafted that pattern as well, so that it was like 2 inches too small and I just chopped a bit in. Sometimes I forget I'm quite good at this. So I've just looked at the bodice of my inspiration dress again. This is one of the benefits of making something from, or using something from the John Bright collection as inspiration. Again, there'll be a link to in the description to what I'm talking about, because I will not be able to license these images for this video. The benefit of having all these high-res images that you can zoom in is you get really excellent construction details. And so I was just looking at how the sort of fake stomacher bit is, or like the more like what are those called, robings. I was just looking at how those are done on this dress, and I've just realized that I've completely cut the bodice wrong. I had assumed that the line I was looking at here was a seam, but I don't think this bodice is shaped with seams at all. I've just noticed there's an extra seam line, or possibly a dart, at the centre front waist, and then this panel is just applied on top because it's cut on the bias, so I can see sort of the grain is different. So that leaves me with a dilemma. Do I want to change the construction of my bodice? I don't think so, but that does make installing this panel a lot easier because I can just cut it and pin it on and drape it on, you know. Also, it looks like the sleeves are cut on the bias, joy, and the peplum pieces are too. And goodness knows what I'm going to do for the trim. I might have to do like rouleau trim, because I doubt I'm going to get anything to match well enough. And I don't know what I've decided for my little like toggles down the front either. Don't know what I'm going to do about those. I mean, covered buttons, I need to do some more research. To be honest, I do quite like the simplicity of just having a completely plain bodice. I'm a really unfussy sort of person. Well, we'll see. Right, what I want to do is pin in roughly how much I want to take out of this armhole, and sort of where I want to take it out. I think it needs to really be there. Yep, so I think I'm going to do this alteration first, then shape the side seams. So, the plan for my pattern pieces. So I've pinched out a dart here into the armhole on this pattern piece. So I'm going to, this is the bust point, I'm going to do some basic dart manipulation, pin in that dart, pivot it out, and it will essentially open up into this seam more. This back pattern piece, you can see here, these creased drag lines here. It needs to, this pattern piece actually I think needs to be a touch wider through here. So that's this pattern piece. It needs just a bit more width in this seam. And then I'm, like I say, I'm going to fisheye it ever so slightly, flare it out more at the bottom, and take it in just a touch, probably like not even a centimetre, just to sort of naturally, this is just a straight line, and I've put on a corset which is hugging completely to my figure, which is not going to create a solid straight line. So I think just softening that line should do the trick. Everything needs to be longer, at least to the seam allowance, but also this curve here, you can see that crease there, it's too tight, so it needs to be wider at this point. And this curve here, I need to round out a bit because it's a bit too pointed, and I want a sort of more gradual kind of diagonal line there. So I'll probably need more width in this seam as a result, and at the bottom of this seam. I don't think I'll be able to reuse that toile, but that's all right. But what I think I'm going to do is actually trace off a whole new pattern, because I need to add length. Oh, the other thing I want to do is, you see how this comes to a point? I just want to hollow it out just a touch there, so that it's not quite as pointy at the front. But I do think I wanted the front point just a touch higher, so maybe it'll be more like I add a bit and fill it in. So I think let's start with the easy ones, the front and the back, because there's not too many alterations to those, just the length. Yeah, I'll see you in a bit, I guess. Of course, one of the things I hadn't thought about as I was tracing this off is that if I want this to remain the same width at the bottom here, which I do, if I make it longer, if I carry this line on, it's going to come to a point. So I need to probably reset that line. So I want it to be at least 1.5 centimetres. Let's go 2 centimetres actually for good luck. Will be that. But I also was just considering the fact that actually it probably needs to flare out again rather than come straight down. It probably needs to be a touch wider there. So it should be more like that as a curve. Where's Nora War? Let's have a look at the originals and see what they do. Yeah, they do flare out at the centre back. They're at this one. is a ball gown bodice and it flares out at the centre back. So yeah, just a touch. So yeah, let's have a look at this one. I'm gonna have to pin this one in place. I did feel that maybe the top edge of this was a touch wide, as in here, so I might just come in ever so slightly, because I want this cut on the fold. So I could shape the centre front seam, but because I want it on the fold, it's not going to happen. Let's trace it off as it is for now. So that's the waistline, that's the bust point. So yes. Let's just go for like 1/2 centimetre maybe. Yeah, I think that will be okay because it's going to really tilt out, isn't it? So again, maybe let's just shave just a fraction off this piece. And then it was just the length really, wasn't it? So I definitely wanted it at least 1/2 centimetre, like 1.5 centimetres longer. So I think let's actually go for 2 centimetres. And I want it 2 centimetres longer here as well. But what I need to do really... Yeah, I'm just going to leave the excess paper here and then do it later. For the dart into the armhole, I penciled in where I had pinned the dart in place. Next, I deconstructed the mock-up and pinned the original pattern piece back onto it to line everything up as best I could. I then pinwheeled over the pencil marks to transfer the markings to the paper pattern. I could then line that pattern piece up with my new tracing and mark where those pinwheel marks were. I then pivoted out the dart fullness and drew in the new position of the neckline and armhole. This is exactly the same as the slashing technique, it just skips the cutting and sticking things back together part. I can even check how accurate it is by folding the dart out and then comparing the shape of the pattern piece to my new outline. It was then time to make toile number 2 using all these new pattern pieces. Right, so again, less than ideal setup because I don't have any space to show you this, but this is mock-up number 2, and while I'm still getting some creasing and pooling there, I'm going to put some padding in here. Some cotton wadding, which is perfectly historically accurate, and I reckon that will sort that out. The issue I have now is that this armhole is too small, and even just, can you see? It's ripped as I've been like pottering about, getting the camera ready and everything here. So this distance here needs to be longer, and I think that means I'll have to really scoop out the front here. I'm going to look at some historical examples and see what they do. But apart from that, I'll have to move further away. The only other alteration I've made is to this bottom edge, and I don't know if you can see that, yeah, I ripped the fabric there. So what I've done is I let out both seams here, and I didn't need to, I needed to let out one side because I ended up with, I don't know if you can see on this diagonal line, this panel now flares out and I want it to be completely straight. So I sort of just left the seam allowance pointing under and folded it until this panel was in a straight line, and that will be my new sewing line there. I've penciled it in, not that you can see because of the lighting, but also I've penciled in here, again, where it's ripped, approximately where I think I want my new armhole to go. I might even have to hollow it out more there. But that's the thing with these tight off the shoulder styles, it's always going to be restrictive. But the neckline, the new length I'm happy with. At the back, which I can't really see, maybe you can see better. There's something funny happening here. One panel is longer than the other. I think I just need to chew that up because I'm happy with the length of this panel. So I need to make these few tweaks to the pattern pieces and to this mock-up. I'm going to keep using this mock-up. I need to draft a sleeve and the peplum bits and the applied robing. It's like an applied sort of decoration, which is sort of an imitation of 18th century style stomacher robings. I think this is pretty darn good, actually. And to say we only needed 2 mock-ups for this sort of thing, I thought I would need a lot more. But today is not a good day for pain, so I am going to take all this crap off my body and put my comfy clothes back on and start working on some of those things. Did I tell you what they were? I can't remember. So do all the other tweaks on this draft a sleeve and mock up the sleeve, and also the peplum bits for the bottom and the applied robing bit. So you know how sometimes when you're making something, things just inexplicably go your way? Look at this sleeve. I can't believe it. This armhole and sleeve adjustment, which I thought was going to be really, really like sketchy, shaky, don't know what I mean. I thought it was going to be bad. It's actually fine. It's perfect. It fits, I can move. It's not sitting perfectly on the roll of my shoulder, but oh well. It's a touch wide. It needs to taper in more at the bottom, but it's fine. And literally, do you know, I literally looked at a diagram in Nora Wore, sort of went, meh, that'll do. And it's worked. I mean, I was so nervous about this. I was considering changing the design to be gathered sleeve, like to mimic my chemise, because I like the way these two look together. And I also was like, gathered sleeves are a lot easier to set in than straight cut sleeves. And I was like, well, I'll try it. First time, brilliant. It's also cut on the bias. Maybe that helped, I don't know. But when I zoomed in on the pictures of my inspiration dress, the sleeves were cut on the bias, as are like the tabs and the robing. So I'll be cutting those on the bias as well. But this has gone so successfully, I think I might call it a day, just because I don't want to jinx it. I don't know. Amazing. Huh. I think we are finally there. I'm really pleased with the fit. I'm really pleased with how all the lines are hitting. Naturally, the mannequin is not quite the same size as me, so it's not as smooth on her as it is on me, particularly around the waist and things. I've also mocked up the decoration, which I must confess, when I first did it, I don't like it. Put a pin in that so I can gesticulate wildly with my hands. It does look like my inspiration dress, so there's that. It also, however, looks very 18th century, which, as you know, I don't like. I think part of the issue is I really love the sort of very simplistic lines of the 1840s, and I've now just covered it in ruffles. And it doesn't appeal to my natural tastes, I suppose. So I have considered sacking all this off and just making a Bertha, or just having a plain dress, because that is also an option. They did have completely plain dresses. I have requested some second opinions from my mum and various sewing and knitting friends to see what they think, and they all think, my mum went, oh, it's really pretty. And I do seem to remember having a similar sort of crisis when I made Little Dorrit, and I was like, oh my God, it looks awful. So I don't know whether it's partly like when you work on any long-term project and you just sort of are sick of looking at it. I don't know whether I'm going through that phase or whether I really don't want to do this. I'm looking at it again and I kind of want to make a Bertha. Oh no! Why am I like this? I think I'm going to make a Bertha instead. I just prefer them, and I also love, there's some with some like knitted lace on, or crocheted lace, and I'd love to be able to do that, to add some knitted trim. Have I got time to knit trim? I have a month. Maybe I could just do a little bit down the front. Well, looks like I have to figure out how to make a Bertha now. So it's going to be considerably longer than this. It's going to come down to a bit here. I've reworked my pattern piece. Yeah, better. But that was actually surprisingly simple to do, and I'm much happier. It's probably going to be less work. I'm going to knit a bit of trim to go down the centre front, so it'll only be a little bit, but maybe if I've got time I might do a bit more. I don't know, we'll see. So the next step, before I cut my fancy fabric, is to cut my lining fabric. And for this I'm using a brown cotton silesia, which is a specialist lining fabric I bought a while ago for a half scale project. So you can probably see I didn't use a lot of it, only that much. So I've got about 1 metre of this, and hopefully that will be enough lining fabric to get the bodice out of. I haven't decided if I'm going to line the skirt, interline it, probably might use tarlatan. But yeah, we're finally cutting out. But before I do that, haven't really got space to work. So it's 5 to 1, so I'll probably tidy up, eat lunch, and then start cutting out when I come back. Oh, naturally this also will need a good press. But it's finally happening, we're finally onto the making, and I'm really excited. I'm so glad I made this decision. I love it, it's gonna be great. Let's go. So I started by giving the silesia a good press. I couldn't get all of the creases out, but oh well, it's a lining. And then I had to carefully plot the cutting layout. My pattern pieces have no seam allowance, and I like to cut my costumes with at least 2.5 centimetres of seam allowance to make them easy to alter in the future. But with limited meterage, I had to get a bit creative. Thankfully, I did have enough of this fabric. With that hurdle overcome, I could start cutting my nice silk. Finally. I often get cutting anxiety, but I was so excited to actually get to the silk that I just went for it. Again, I've got my massive seam allowances chalked on. And then it was time to start the tacking marathon. I was flatlining this bodice, that is, laying the lining piece on top of each fashion fabric piece, sewing them together and then treating them as one layer of fabric. This is the historically accurate way to do it. It's also done in couture, and for costumes it again makes things easier to alter in the future. I try and get them as smooth as possible on top of each other, making sure I'm matching all of the balance marks and seams. Obviously, things are never going to match up exactly, even if you are much better at cutting out than I am, so I tend to use the sewing lines of the lining as my constant, and if the main fabric is a bit off, it's not the end of the world. You can also see in some places I've deliberately cut the main fabric to be bigger, so I've got room to fudge things if I need to. And then I use long diagonal basting stitches through the centre of the two layers to start attaching them together. I start in the middle so that I can smooth outwards as I go. I'm using a contrast thread here so that you can see it, but it is often a good idea to use a matching thread so that if any fibres shed or get stuck, they're not as noticeable. As I work outwards, I start to drape the pattern pieces over my tailor's ham rather than working with it flat on the table. This is to accommodate the curve of the body. The fashion fabric has fractionally further to go around the body than the lining, so if I were to sew them together completely flat on the table, when I then put it on, I could get some wrinkling in the fashion fabric as it's pulled that bit tighter than the lining. It's a marginal thing, but I like to think it made a difference to getting a smooth finish on the bodice. I also tacked in all the balance marks, also known as notches or registration marks. I do this so that I can see them on both sides of the fabric. As I've sewn the lining and main together, I can no longer see where I chalked in the markings on the fashion fabric. For that same reason, I also tack in all the sewing lines, although I don't tack exactly along the chalked in line, but along the inside edge of it so that I don't catch the tacking when machining it later. Yes, it's long and tedious, and removing them later is a massive pain, but there's no other way to really get things sewn accurately, so I always do it for a big project like this. As annoying as it is, I've never once regretted taking the time to do it. So if I look a little bit baked, it's because I've actually finished off the hand sewing for this in the garden, which makes a nice change, doesn't it? We're finally at that time of year. So I've basted together all my layers and basted on all the sewing lines and the balance marks. I did a lot of it over my ham to try and get the curve of the body in, but like the sleeves, I don't think I've quite managed to get enough of a curve in really. But we'll see, hopefully it'll be better than nothing. I'm probably now going to, as you can see, it's just like pinned in place on the mannequin, but I'm loving the way it looks, lovely and gold and sparkly. So I'm probably going to pin some seams together, do a little bit of modular making here. I have been contemplating piping the seams, but I don't think I have enough piping cord for that. I definitely want to pipe the neckline and the bottom edge of the bodice, and so I won't know I have enough piping to do that really until I've sewn it up. So we're not piping the bodice seams. I do want to pipe the shoulder seam, but it's only this long, so that should be fine. I've been thinking about the order of operations for this one because obviously the bertha needs to be sandwiched in the shoulder seam. So I need to make up the front and sort of pleat the bertha before I attach it to the back. It's actually going to come together quite quickly, I think. Famous last words, eh? Look at the ridiculous amount of pins I used to pin everything together. Was every one of those pins entirely necessary? Actually, now I think about it, a lot of those seams were curved, and easing in curved seams well is very tricky, and so actually the answer is probably yes. Although I do wonder why I didn't just tack it together. And here I've included a clip in real time of how long it actually takes me to sew a seam like this. I'm sewing very carefully, just outside the line of tacking stitches. As I slightly offset these earlier, that should mean I'm sewing precisely along the chalked in line that I transferred from the sewing pattern. I also stop to take up my pins very carefully so that I don't distort the fabric or pull it out of line, and I sew slowly. This is not the kind of project where I'm just ramming it through the machine. I spent all that time perfecting the fit, moving seams over just a few millimeters, and I don't want all that work to have been for nothing. And now you see me batch sewing at 10 times speed because just watching that clip back was painfully boring. Oh my god, all those pins! That's me checking to see how I did easing that curve in, and all the pins obviously paid off because it worked first time. And now for the other half of the back. You might have noticed I sewed one half with the back piece facing up and the other half with the side back piece facing up. This means I have to ease in the curves differently under the machine. The first time I had the shorter edge of the back facing up, so I was having to stretch it lightly, but this time I have the longer edge facing up, so I'm having to smooth it in. I prefer doing it this second way, but I thought it was more important to sew both seams from top to bottom to smooth the fabric in the same direction to avoid the seams shifting in opposite directions. It's the same thing again for the front, starting at the top and working towards the hem, despite it making it trickier to ease in, so that I can get everything smoothed in the same direction. Here you can see me checking it from the right side to see if all those balance marks matched up across the seam. That's why tacking them in is so useful, because it's really difficult to tell if they line up from the lining side once it's sewn. And then even the side seams are curved, so more easing in. This one was a bit easier being shorter and more gently curved. Now it's time for pressing! As every single seam is curved, I really needed the help of my tailor's ham. It also doesn't help with the massive seam allowances. Yes, they're great for alterations, but all that extra fabric can pull, and clipping them kind of eliminates the point of leaving all that seam allowance in there, so I just had to try my best to press everything flat and just had to accept it wasn't going to be as neat as it could be. With the bodice made up as much as I could, I now needed to make the Bertha before I could carry on. My pattern piece had this weird dart in it to give it the shape I would need over the bust. I'd only chalked it on one half for some reason, so I transferred my chalk markings to the other side using a tracing wheel. This leaves a little row of indentations on the other side of the fabric, so I went over them with the chalk to make them easier to see. Then I carefully pinned in the darts. Like everything else on this project, they were slightly curved, so they were tricky to get to match up evenly. Then I machined them in place. You might have noticed I reversed at the end of the dart here, which I don't usually do, but I decided to do it here to prioritise strength over a crisp point. This dart is going to be covered in fabric, and that's going to be really difficult to get to should it come undone and I need to fix it. Now the darts get pressed towards the centre. Don't mind me, I was just having a chat to my mum while I was doing this. And then I put this lining layer of the Bertha on the stand over the pinned in place bodice so I could start draping the pleats. So it took me a good 2 hours, more than that, about 2 hours and 10 minutes, to arrange the pleats for the Bertha on the stand. And so I've taken it off now, they're tacked in place, but it looked like this before. I was really nervous because in this photograph the light, I think I used the different side of the fabric or a different grain of the fabric or whatever. So they are a slightly different sort of shade. But I tried flipping it over and thinking, is it worth redoing it? But I think it's just because I've got like opposite biases I've used, if that makes sense. But I think it's just because it's the nature of it being shot, it's going to look different. I've smoothed it down and it looks a bit better. I don't know. It's one of those things I was like, oh no. I'm not going to fix it. It's just going to be a character of this dress, if you like. Oh well. So I've been wondering about how to finish the edges of this. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to trim it down and turn everything, you know, both edges in and whip over the edges. I think that's probably what I'm going to do. It's probably going to be easiest. And at the centre front, I'll probably press one edge under to meet at the centre front and hand sew it down. You didn't see what I did there, did you? So just fold it under, fold, trim back some more of this excess, fold it under, and then hand sew it on top so I can really control where the pleats line up. And then there is going to be a bit of knitted applied trim there. Yeah, so I'm really tired now, my back hurts, and this took so much longer than I expected, and now I'm a little bit worried about running out of time on this. After this, I have to do the piping. Naturally, I have to join the shoulder seams, I have to make the skirt, I have to finish my edges inside, but that's not the end of the world. I can have unfinished edges if necessary. I originally, you can maybe see, it's going to be out of focus, I'm sorry, you'll just have to cope with that. You can see here I haven't clipped the seam at the waistline and it's puckering, and I was hoping I could get away with not clipping it so it could be easier to alter in the future, but I think I'm just going to have to clip it, unfortunately, because it's wrinkly and ugly and it's going to pull otherwise. I need to do boning and fastenings and, of course, make the skirt. So I've still got quite a lot to do. I better crack on. Getting these pleats sewn in place meant even more fussing with them. Honestly, this was such a lot of work, I really began to regret this decision in the end. I'm not sure if this was the best way to construct a bertha. If I'd had more time, I would have done some more research to try and find a better method, particularly for finishing these edges because it was so time consuming. I thankfully realised that I only needed to finish the bottom edge of the bertha as the top edge could be finished with the neckline piping, but sewing this one, having already tacked the pleats in place, was a nightmare. I had to do it from the wrong side to be able to see the tacked in line of the neckline, but I needed to make sure I only caught the first layer of fabric, not the fabric of the first pleat that would lie on that first bit of fabric, so it looks like the pleats emerge seamlessly from the neckline. It was fiddly and annoying, and I'm sure there would have been a better way to make this work, but I didn't have the time to do any more research, so I just went for it. It did work, but boy, it was annoying. Next, I had to make the piping. Thankfully, I had lots of scrap fabric left from the bertha that was already sort of cut on the bias that made this less wasteful and easier to cut. This is the part of the video where people will be screaming at their screens, "Why don't you just use a rotary cutter?" This is your reminder that they are painful and dangerous for me to use because of my disability, and that there's no such thing as the right way to do things in sewing. If it works for you and you get a good result, then it's the right way. If it doesn't work for you, then do it in a way that does work for you, and that's okay too. We're all individual people with individual needs, and I need to have the blades as far away from my fingers as possible, thank you. And now we're making the piping. See that there, where my fingers stopped working and I flicked the presser foot across the sewing machine? That's why I don't want a spinning blade anywhere near them. Anyways, yes, the piping. So I have this narrow piping cord, I think it's 3mm, in my stash from when I made Little Dorrit. And I fold the bias strips over it, encasing the cord, and then using the zipper foot I stitch close, but not too close to the cord. You might have noticed I haven't folded the fabric of the bias strip over evenly, and that's because you only grade it down later anyway, and this way you can make the bias strips thinner and save fabric. I then pinned the piping all around the neckline on the right side and machined it in place. I'm lining the sewing line of the neckline up with the inside edge of the piping cord so that it's really snug. I deliberately didn't stitch it this snugly earlier so that there won't be any visible stitching now. When I flip the piping around to the inside, all the raw edges will be enclosed and it'll give a really neat finish. I'm having to be very careful to avoid the pleats of the bertha here too, so I'm really taking my time. I then did the same thing for the back neckline. This was a lot easier as there was no bertha or decoration on the back. I'm piping the entire back edge, including the overlap for the fastenings, and leaving lots of excess at the shoulders. This should make it very easy to alter. All I'd have to do is move the hooks and bars, and even if I had to put a piece in at the shoulder, I'd have enough piping there to still have a nice continuous line at the neck. With the necklines finished, I could join the shoulder seams, making sure the edges of the piping lined up. With all that extra bulk from the bertha, I decided to turn the stitch length up a bit to hopefully make the seam a bit smoother. I had to do a little bit of fiddling around to figure out how I wanted to finish the seam in the piping so it was subtle and smooth, but I was confident my plan would work, so I repeated the process for the bottom edge so I could move on to the hand finishing. Okay, so where are we? I've been finishing the top and bottom necklines, so the top is all herringboned in, and I've pinned the bottom in place, ready to hand sew, which I'm probably going to do in the garden because it's nice weather. As you can see, I haven't finished the ends at the top yet, but at the bottom as well, I've left loads of extra piping in. And I've done it in sections. So at every seam, there's also a seam in the piping. And that is deliberate to make it much easier to alter should I ever need to alter it. Because the likelihood is I'll get bigger and I'll need to let it out. So I'll need extra piping. I've also piped, that's the centre back, and I've piped all the way to the edge here. So the easiest way would be to just move the hooks so that then I don't have to do anything, I can just move the hooks. So that's the logic there. I'm going to hand sew this, and then my next, in terms of order of operations, next would be to put in the sleeves. And there's several things that I'm nervous about in terms of putting in the sleeves. Firstly, the armhole is so tight and I'll need to snip into it, and I'm worried about just ripping through. Also, where I've applied my bertha, you can see it goes over the sewing line. So should I put the sleeve in on top of the bertha, or should I try and unpick this a little bit and then reapply the bertha on top. And seeing as it took me so long to get this bertha just right, I'm reluctant to unpick it. And I have looked at some examples and they do have the bertha caught in the sleeve seam. You know, I think it will work, but yeah, I'm nervous about that. And then as well, if I put piping in there, that's going to be a really bulky seam. And it's already really tight. And we have these two stupid weird angles because that's the nature of this sort of sleeve. I don't think I have any piping left, so maybe we don't pipe them. Will the piping help with the not ripping it out? Will it act as a sort of like stay stitching? Maybe. Maybe that's why they did it. Well, first things first, I've got herringbone this piping down, so let's do that first. Look at this messy, messy desk. So yeah, herringbone stitch is also known as a catch stitch, and I'm using it here because it's a curved edge and it gives the fabric movement. It gives it room to move about and shape to curves. So I could have turned this edge under and felled it down, but as this is a bias cut edge, it won't fray. Also, herringboning over it is sort of got the same effect as an overlocker stitch. It will stop it unraveling. So it's just flatter, quicker, more efficient to do it this way. And I'm not going through to the front of the fabric, I'm just catching the flat lining. I did indeed decide to pipe the armholes. I did some research and yeah, the reason that they used piping was to reinforce that very tight and restrictive sleeve seam. You see, people in the past weren't stupid. There was usually a logic to the things they did. I mean, it wasn't always a correct logic, but sometimes it was. This is me pressing the piping into a curve completely out of frame. But pressing it vaguely into the shape you're going to sew it onto can make it easier to attach. This was still incredibly fiddly, especially around the almost right angle that these armholes have at the point where the underarm section begins, but eventually the sleeves were in. A tan and a roller set. It's like pre-pandemic Claude. So, the bodice is nearly there. We are down to now just hand sewing tasks mostly. So I need to put the bones in, I need to hem the sleeves, but I want to do that with it on properly with all the gear on so that I know I've definitely got them in the right place, because I also need to do some research and look and see just how long they are. Do they reach to the crook of the elbow? Do they need to, you know, I'm not sure. I have my hand knitted trim, which I have now finished knitting, which is upstairs, so I can't show it to you, which needs to be hand sewn on the front and the shoulders, and I have to do the centre back fastening, and then we're onto the skirt. So I have spiral steel, which I think is what I'm going to use for the boning, which yes is heavy but is quite comfortable in terms of flexibility, so I think that's what I'm going to use. I just have to figure out what I'm going to use as boning channels. Do I want to cut strips of fabric, or should I use just like cotton tape or something? So today is not a great day. I had an event yesterday which has tired me out, hence the hair. I'd forgotten how bouncy it is. So it's just sort of thing I'm in the mood for, really, a gentle bit of hand sewing. Although I don't know whether I'll be strong enough to cut the bones. I might have to recruit a willing volunteer to help with that. Also known as my dad. This is the kind of chaos I work in.
With the bones cut to length with the help of my glamorous assistant, I started adding the little metal caps. I used needle nose pliers for this, but it was so fiddly and they kept popping off, so I don't know if I did this right. The process was really annoying, so if you know of a better solution for these, please let me know. To make the boning channels, I just used some twill tape and folded it around the steels using a zipper foot to sew them inside the tape snugly. This isn't the most elegant way to make boning channels, but it was quick. Then I could hand sew the bones in place. I waxed the thread for strength and herringboned them into the flat lining over the seams. I'm going through the layers of the twill tape and the seam allowance and the flat lining so they're really secure in there. The bone casings are a touch too long for the bones, so I can scrunch up the tape ever so slightly as I sew it in to keep the fabric under tension and get that sprung feel. This effect is difficult to describe, but it is a bit like easing in a seam. The extra length of the bone should pull the shorter seam taut and keep it under tension so it doesn't collapse.
So, I didn't get very much done yesterday. Like I say, it was a bad day. But what I did manage to do was put everything on, apart from the chemise. Hang on. Rustle, rustle, rustle. So I managed to herringbone the bones in. Unfortunately, I don't know what's happened. This thumb, it's given up. It just hates hand sewing at the minute. I can't grip anything with it, which is really annoying when you're trying to herringbone in sprung steel boning because you need to really grip it. But I was able to do that and I tried it on, and the sleeves, I took the sleeves in from the mock-up and I've taken them in too much. I need to let them out a bit more. And I was hoping I wouldn't have to cut anything away around the armhole, but there's a lot of stuff in there and it's just a bit too tight. So what I might do is trim some of it out. The piping I can definitely trim. I don't want to snip into it and notch it because that makes it more likely to tear. And I have 1.5 centimetres seam allowance there anyway, so I don't really want to cut away any more of the actual seam allowance. But I'll see what I can do, basically. I think at this point there needs to be less somewhere. Plan for the day, alter the sleeves. I still need to hem the sleeves, but because I couldn't get my arms in quite far enough, I wasn't sure how much I wanted to hem the sleeves. I also want to look at some like fashion plates to see just how long they are. And then I've got to do the back closure, and because it's quite snug, so I might sort of give myself an extra 0.5 centimetre when I sew the bars in or something like that, or when I put the hooks in, something like that. So I've got a little bit more wiggle room to breathe. Again, look at the chaos on this desk. Oh my God. So I'm going to keep them the same at the armhole because that bit's fine. It's just over the bicep. So I think I took it in 2 centimetres on each pattern piece. So like maybe a bit more like that. Yeah, down to 1 centimetre. So that can be my new sewing line. Where's the other one? Unfortunately, this silk turns out marks quite badly, even though I did a test. Obviously didn't leave the stitching in long enough. So I've got all this basting, which is going to leave marks, and probably when I let this seam out, there'll be a mark too. Grand. This is why we leave large seam allowances. Tell you what, while we're here, I'm doing it one layer at a time so I don't accidentally cut something I don't want to. I'm going to leave this bit in because if I ever want to adjust that seam, I'll need that bit there. So that will just have to flap about, unfortunately. I can at least trim some of the excess silk there and here. Having reduced as much bulk as I could around the armholes, I let the sleeves out. I stitched in the new seam before unpicking the old one. I did end up with the silk scarring, but as it's mostly in my armpit, I don't mind too much, and it was worth it to have the sleeves be more comfortable. With that adjustment made, I added the spiral steel to the centre back seam. I tacked it in by hand first and used my zipper foot to get really close to the edge of the bone so it wouldn't wriggle around in the boning channel. You can see me using my fingernail to really push that bone as far over into the seam as possible so I can sew it in there really tightly. Here you can see just how bad the scarring is on that underarm seam. I hoped that wetting it first would help to get the creasing out, if not the stitch marks, but it didn't really make that much of a difference. So I'm at the point of sewing on the hooks, and I do this in a very similar way to Nikki from Liam. She has an excellent tutorial very detailed tutorial on how to do it. It's kind of interesting. I guess if you make opera or ballet costumes globally, there's sort of a standard way of doing things. But what I have realised is I only have this many of this hook. I need to buy some more, and so it means I'm having to space them further apart than I would like. But basically what I did was put one top and bottom, and then I had 8 left, so I divided the difference between them by 8 to find approximately where I wanted, how far apart they were. My bottom 2 are 4mm closer together than the rest of them, but that's all right because quite often that's where you want more support. So I've got doubled silk buttonhole twist here, which I have put beeswax on. This brown colour was sort of the best match I had, but I'm not that bothered about it. It's quite subtle. And you can see I've sort of moved my centre back over about the bone's width, and that should hopefully just give me a little bit more room to breathe. So I'm going to sew these hooks on. I might be here for a while, and then I'll show you the bars. Where did it go? So all the hooks are now on, and I've also sewn on the bottom 2 bar, or the top and bottom bar, and you can see I've set them in a bit from that centre back line. Oh, you can't see that, and that's because firstly I want a bit more room, but also when you hook it and it's held under tension, of course, it doesn't sit exactly on that line. So what we're going to do now is I'm just going to hook those back in, and then I'm going to fold this like that. And I could use a pin, but because this fabric marks so much, I'm just going to do it with chalk instead. And again, I'm just sewing over it with the waxed buttonhole thread. I'm only doing 3 stitches like that because if I'm likely to let it out, it's much easier to move the bars than it is the hooks. So as much as I want it secure, I don't want it so secure that I'll hate myself if ever I need to alter it. Let's be having you. Oh, also, I did the classic thing of divided by 8, which of course gave me 8 gaps and 7 hooks. So I've got 1 left over. I'm going to say this was deliberate, and this is my spare one, just in case, you know, I lose one. I could have put interfacing on this section, but I haven't, purely because I forgot. So let's just hope for the best. And I'm putting the opening of the hook. This is something that Nikki talks about as well. There's like a little opening where it's been bent round. I'm putting that facing the hook because it's a bit stronger that way. With the bars on, all I had to do was add the knitted trim to the shoulders and centre front. I'd knitted the trim using a vintage knitting pattern for insertion lace from a knitting pattern book from the 1840s. I used silk embroidery thread as the yarn, and I was able to sew the trim on with the same thread, so it matched perfectly. So, the bodice is finally done, which means we're now onto the skirt, which hopefully shouldn't be as complicated as the bodice was. No fitting really necessary. I'm going to cut some rectangles and gather them onto a waistband. However, I have a bit of a dilemma because ideally I would flatline the skirt. However, as I discovered from making this, unfortunately, if I put a pin or even a tacking thread in this fabric, I get a little pin mark left. So unfortunately, all down the centre front and every panel and lots of other places, I have marks from where I put tacking in. When you flatline big panels, really, you need to do lots of big tacking stitches down through the middle of them. And I'm not going to be able to do that. And I have contemplated, can I like buy some of that spray stuff that quilters use? Can I use double-sided tape? Things like that. But I think I'm just gonna not flatline the skirt. I think it will be okay. I've got lots of big puffy petticoats. I think I'm going to face the hem instead, and that should hopefully give it some volume as well. That's the plan. I've got my cutting table out. I've tidied up a bit. So I think let's make a start on the skirt. I've got a dilemma now because I've just unrolled the silk to cut my skirt panels, and it's got loads of long flaws all the way across the width of the yardage. And I was like, oh, at first I thought it was just at this end, and I was like, oh, okay, but the more I go, look, there's another one. They look like pulls or something. Yeah, can you see it? Yeah. There's another one right down this folded section here. So I bought this fabric dead stock, and I imagine I think it was also listed as second, so it was cheap, which was why I was able to afford real silk for this. And it is Dupion, so it does have slubs in, but that is so noticeable. Do I really want that going across the horizontal width of my dress? And yes, I know it's going to be gathered, but part of me is wondering if it's actually better to have it run vertically, and it'll get slightly more lost in the pleats and the gathers and things, in which case I would just cut however many meters I want for the circumference of my skirt, which I think I looked up in Nora War. I want about 3 meters 20, something like that. Just hem and sort of use the silk as a facing. I think that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to cut this way instead and just have one seam at the centre back and a very deep hem.
I'm a fool, because what I hadn't considered is, of course, this fabric is shot. So if I have the skirt going in that direction, it's a completely different colour to the bodice. Shit. So there's not much I can do, so I'll just have to cut this into panels or just completely recut the skirt fabric and just deal with the fact that there's going to be ugly horizontal lines all across it, which is really annoying given how much work and effort and stuff I've put into this project. That's the price you pay for being poor, I guess. That was a joke. As the silk was very crumpled from my trying it this way and that, I took it upstairs to the big ironing board and the big iron to give it a proper press. It had been folded on the bolt for well over a year, so there were some pretty deep set creases to go with all those flaws in the fabric. Being a silk Dupion, once it was cut into panels, it started to shred the raw edges, so everything got overlocked. I didn't do any seam finishing on the bodice, but as the seams were mostly curved, they didn't fray in the same way as the skirt panels. Wherever possible, I tried to use the selvage of the fabric, and of course, I'm chalking in my sewing lines so that those skirt seams will be nice and straight. Naturally, no ball gown is complete without a set of pockets, so I cut out some of the leftover cotton silesia lining fabric to make mine. This pattern I drafted myself based on the examples in books like Janet Arnold, and I referenced some YouTube videos on the subject. To make the pocket opening less visible when the skirt is worn, I included a pocket facing. I cut this from a scrap of the silk, and it's just the same shape as the pocket pattern piece, it just ends after a few centimetres. The facing is pinned in place and then overlocked to the fabric of the pocket, as well as all the other raw edges of the pocket pieces. You might be wondering why I'm using black thread on my overlocker and not brown, and that's just because I didn't have any brown, I'm cheap and didn't want to buy any, and at this point I was kind of in a hurry to get this done, so details like that weren't high up on my list of priorities. The raw edge of the silk facing piece just got zigzagged in place. There are neater ways to do this, but this method is quick and easy, and it does the job. It's the inside of a pocket on a ball gown I'm probably going to wear once. Like I say, priorities. I couldn't put the pockets in a seam because of the way I had to cut the panels of the skirt, so I had to cut a slit in the centre of a panel and sew the pieces of the pocket lining to the slit instead. Everything got a good press, and then I stitched a short dart in the bottom of the pocket seam to kind of fake a side seam. Again, Nikki from Liam has a whole series on this technique if you'd like to do this for yourself, which explains it in much more detail than the rushed clips I was taking at this point in the process. And then you can sew the two halves of the pocket together. This bit is very tricky, and you have to be incredibly precise with where you start stitching so that you don't end up sewing too far and the pocket opening doesn't line up. After that, you just have to sew around the curves, which, I mean, isn't the easiest, but if your pocket bag's a bit wonky, it's much less noticeable than if the opening is all puckered. Again, you have to be very precise where you stop sewing, and I made sure to check that I'd done a good job, and yeah, I was pretty pleased with it. You can barely see the pocket is there, which is what we want. With the pockets in place, I could sew up the side seams of all the panels into a tube. Of course, I left an opening at the centre back so that I could get the skirt on. I'm following my chalked on sewing lines so that everything stays lovely and straight. Then the skirt seams get a press, naturally, and I fussed about with the pocket openings some more to press those in place and make them even more invisible.
Here I'm cutting strips of fusible interfacing for the top of the skirt where I'm going to cartridge pleat it. You can get interfacing on a roll for this purpose, but I just used what I had. I used the iron to fuse the interfacing to the top edge of my skirt, and this will create the folded over edge through which I sew my cartridge pleats. The cartridge pleats were only going to be on the back of the skirt. For the front, I was doing a box pleat in the centre and then knife pleats either side. There's a whole formula to figure out how wide to make your pleats. I did try that method, and I'm using that piece of dotted paper there as a template, but honestly, no matter how much maths and measuring I do, and I'm a confident mathematician, I always end up with things being a little bit off anyway, so I try not to worry about it too much. Having studied quite a few historical garments myself, I just do what the Victorians do and make the outside of the pleats look nice and even, and just fudge the inside until it fits. I have come to prefer using clips for pleats. I knew I was probably going to have to move them, and given the way this fabric marked, I knew I didn't want to be sticking loads of pins in it. I found I could use my grader ruler as a set square and my fingernail to make a little crease in the fabric so that I could get a really crisp fold as I made my pleats without having chalk everywhere. I did tack the pleats in place, despite knowing it would leave marks behind, because I thought the trade-off was worth it to not have to keep redoing those pleats. I tried to keep the tacking inside the seam allowance so it wouldn't be seen when the skirt was made up, and then I remembered the bodice will cover it anyway, so I worried about it a little less. You can see all my maths on the note there, but when it came to do the other half of the skirt front, for whatever reason, it didn't work out the same as the other side. I ended up unpicking and redoing the last two pleats to make it fit, and you know what? No one ever noticed. And then this is me ripping off the interfacing I'd just applied to the waistband because it was too wide and reapplying a narrower piece. If you're familiar with cartridge pleating, you'll know you have to make up and finish the waistband and then hand sew the pleats on. But as I also had knife pleats at the front, I was going to have to sew those pleats to the unfinished waistband, then finish it, then do the back pleats. I pressed the waistband in half and marked the centre front, and then where the knife pleats would end, and then where the cartridge pleats would end, leaving a generous amount for overlapping. With the waistband ready, I could start prepping the top of the skirt back for pleating. I turned in the edge of the centre back opening and then folded over the top edge along the edge of the interfacing strip. You can see how crisp the interfacing has made that folded edge now. I then chalked in the lines that I will follow to sew the pleats into the folded top edge. I think mine were 1/2 centimetre down from the top edge and 1 centimetre apart. But of course, before I could start pleating the back, I have to add the waistband to the front. As always, when sewing through lots of layers and pleats, I went incredibly slowly, smoothing and pulling the pleats into position as I go. I could then finish making up the waistband and add the cartridge pleats to the back. As this is done by hand, I think I did it in the evening, hence the dressing gown, but of course things never go smoothly on these projects, do they? So there I was the other evening, sewing away on my skirt waistband, beautifully sewing in all my cartridge pleats, which I was very pleased with. And I got one side on and I thought, oh, I'm just going to try it on and check it's going to fit. And it does fit. However, for reasons that escape me, I put the pocket underneath the cartridge pleats. So that means when I wear the skirt, I can't get my hand in the pocket without like going back on myself like that. So I'm going to have to unpick all of these cartridge pleats and the front half of the waistband, put the pockets the way they're supposed to go, and resew it all again. It's one of those things, it would be fine. I could just have the pockets facing backwards, but I don't want this to just be fine. You know, I want it to be beautiful. I want to feel perfect when I wear it. So, where are my little scissors? Upstairs, great. So yes, I started unpicking all those hand-sewn cartridge pleats, the hand finishing I'd done on the inside of the waistband, and the stitching I'd done to sew the pocket to the waistband. Thankfully, the stitching threads for the pleats themselves could stay in place, but it was a lot of work to undo for such a stupid mistake. And of course, it made putting the waistband back together more difficult, and so for the sake of my hands and my sanity, I made the decision to machine sew the waistband this second time around. See my previous point about it not being seen under the bodice. You know we're really chasing a deadline when the camera starts wobbling.
The cartridge pleats obviously got redone off camera. I think I must have done them in bed, but then I could add the hooks. I didn't have any skirt hooks, so I used fur hooks. They work fine for me. You just have to make sure you tack them down at the end so they don't flap about. I also added a popper to keep the underlap from flapping about. It adds a little extra support to the skirt, but the hook is doing most of the heavy lifting. Now the hem of this skirt. You might remember I said I wanted to face it. Well, because of the way I had to recut the panels after I realised my mistake about the directional colour thing, I had one panel that was considerably shorter than the others. It was barely long enough to turn up at all, so I had to really jerry-rig this bit. To make the facing, I just used strips of calico. I just tore them into lengths, and then you could enjoy some sexy, sexy shots of my elbow as I press them flat and turn under one edge. Phew. I then had to do this weird thing where I pinned the facing to the shortest section of the skirt first, then had to try and keep it level around all the other sections where I had considerably more seam allowance. You can see I'm machining the facing on with barely a foot's width of seam allowance here, but there's loads on the next panel. But once the facing was on, I could press it around to the inside, covering all those weird seam allowances. Then it just needed hand sewing in place, and the dress was ready for the ball. Do you know, I'm really pleased with how this dress turned out. I'm often very critical of my own work, but there's very little I'd want to change about this dress. I'm so glad I went for the Bertha with the knitted trim, and the colour and the shimmer of the silk in the evening light was just gorgeous. I was very relieved to finally have this project done, and it was ready in plenty of time to wear to the ball in Bath. But then a probably not very sensible idea struck me. With a week to go before the ball, I added something else to my to-do list. Thanks for watching. See you next time.
So, having finished my 1840s evening dress, with a week to spare before the ball in Bath, I had the possibly worst idea I've ever had to try and make a late 1830s day dress in a week, as somebody with an energy limiting condition and numerous other commitments. Should we see if I make it? So if I have any hope in hell of making this happen, I need to make this as straightforward on myself as possible. So I'm going to use the pattern that I used to make this dress with a few minor changes to make it late 1830s as opposed to early 1840s. And the reason I'm doing that is because the fit is more forgiving. It doesn't extend below the waist, so you don't have to worry about it fitting over the skirts, it just stops dead. Also, the decoration, setting these pleats took me like 3 hours. I'm not doing that again. So I've actually been looking at an example in Nora War, which is my favourite of the costume history books I have. And I think I'm going for this design on page, oh, it doesn't have page numbers. Diagram 62, if you have this book. This one. And I'm doing that one because actually the decoration is really simple and the pattern manipulation is really straightforward as well. So to get from here to that design won't be too much work. In theory. I have some fabric which I bought online, and it was one of those things I sort of fell in love with the print. It's pink with little green circles and darker pink dashes. I thought it was sort of just right for this era, but it's not a quilt cotton weight. However, when it turned up, I hadn't realised it's only 90 centimetres wide, so I probably won't have enough. So at midnight last night, I sort of panicked about the fact that I was actually going to attempt this project, and I ordered 2 more metres of this fabric to hopefully have enough. It is very lightweight, as you can see, and that means it's a little sheer, so it means I'm going to have to back it with something. I went into my local quilt shop to buy 4 metres of plain white cotton, which cost me a staggering £36, and I'm a little bit like at the thought of paying £9 a metre for plain white cotton that's only 115 centimetres wide. But I guess because it's quilt cotton, it's whatever, OTEX certified and all that sort of thing. So I'm sort of trying to be like, let myself off for the expense of plain white cotton. I can't believe it. Why didn't I just cut up some bed sheets? Anyway, however, like I say, that is 115 centimetres wide and my skirt panels are only going to be 90 centimetres wide. So I was originally going to flatline them, baste them together sort of thing, but I don't think I'm going to be able to do that because the seams are going to be a nightmare. So I think I'm basically going to, well, first of all, I have to pre-wash it. I haven't pre-washed it yet, but I think I'm going to sort of make a drop-in lining and then hem them and pleat them together at the top, which means it probably won't behave exactly how I want it to. I might have to hem them separately. Oh well. So some shortcuts I've already planned on this is I'm going to do a machine blind hem because it really will not show on the print like this. That will make this whole process a lot quicker. I also am not going to cartridge pleat the back like I did on this one because that's a whole bunch of hand sewing that I don't have time for. I'm just going to do pleats in the front and then just ordinary gathers at the back, and that seems to be perfectly accurate for the late 1830s. What I do have to do is spend some time transforming the pattern that fits me that I made for this, because I'll be wearing all the same undergarments, into an 1830s pattern. And it's probably going to be some basic dart manipulation, but also the issue is going to be the shoulder placement because this sits really very off the shoulder, and so I need to raise that up. And also the shape of the armhole is, do I have the pattern pieces? The shape of the armhole is very 1840s. It's got a right angle in it, and you can see it really tilts away and has almost another right angle there. And I don't want that for the 1830s. So I think I'm probably going to go back to my version 1 of this pattern with the mock-up because that had higher armholes, but sort of use the lower fit, half fit of the torso. This is why you always should keep your version 1 pattern pieces. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the armhole from the first version, but the bottom half from the second version. Apart from, I'm just going to straighten it out at the waistline. Looks like the sleeve I can use the same, the top half of the sleeve anyway, and then I just have to draft a pattern piece for the lower sleeve, which is the big poofy section. So wish me luck. Time to start on this pattern.
The pattern alterations for this dress were really quite simple. As I'd kept every version of the patterns I'd made for my 1840s bodice, I could just go back to the version that was closest to what I needed now and work from there. Plus, the pattern itself only had the one dart in the front. All other shaping was done at the side seams. As I was still making quite a few alterations to this version of the pattern, I knew I would need another mock-up. I used a scrap of a bedsheet left over from all the other mock-ups I made and pinned the pattern pieces in place, adding the seam allowance with my Pattern Master ruler. I could then cut the pieces out, and I transferred the markings for the darts using a tracing wheel. Sewing the toile together was thankfully very quick. I used a long stitch length, which helped, but I did my usual order of operations, starting with the darts. I also made the decision to tack in all my sewing lines to make them easier to see when I do the fitting, but I didn't have time for hand basting, so I did it on the sewing machine. It uses more thread, but it's so much quicker. In this case, it would also act as stay stitching. The bodice pieces are cut on the bias, meaning the side seams are cut on an angle. This means they are prone to stretching out and warping, which can mean you don't get an accurate idea of the fit. The stitching should help to prevent any drastic stretching or warping. After this, it was shoulder seams. I then tacked in the sewing lines on the armholes too. I wasn't going to do a sleeve mock-up just yet. I wanted to make sure the armhole was looking right before that, so I needed to see where the sewing line actually was. And then on this style of dress there is a centre front seam, so I stitched up the centre back because it's much easier to pin together the centre front on yourself than it is the centre back, before joining the side seams. You can see there is a chunk missing from the bottom corner of the seam allowance here. That's just because I was working with scrap fabric and it wasn't quite wide enough. And then I did the other side seam and we had a mock-up.
Alright team, we'll have to put up with the non-aesthetic side of the garage, but I don't have space. So, let me talk you through the alterations. This is the mock-up. I think it's pretty good. This is the side I've done the alteration to. As you can probably see, because you can see my chemise, it's too low in the front. I thought it would be, and even 2 centimetres seam allowance is not enough. So, already it's coming unpinned. So this pin here is sort of in line with where I think it should end, so That way it will definitely cover my chemise. I also think this dart is unnecessarily long. So I'm just going to shrink it down a bit. I'm losing hardly any fabric in there anyway, so a bit more bust room. Oh well. The back is also too low, and as I've cut into it, into the hollow of my shoulder blades, it's gaping. This shoulder seam you can see here, I've just changed the angle of the shoulder seam on the back piece, and that should hopefully shrink in that gape there. It's a trade-off. I can't shape the centre back seam, can't really put a dart in it, so once I've got a bone in there it will just gape away from my body. Actually, I think this one says it has a cord, but I'm going to use a bone. Anyway, so not too many alterations. I think this as a lining is going to be perfectly acceptable. It was worth doing this. Yeah, all in all, I don't think that's too bad going. I will have to cut another round of fabric for the lining, but oh well. I also have to create the pleated outer fabric pieces. I also haven't done a sleeve mock-up. I mean, the armhole I think looks pretty good, so the sleeve, I've measured the sleeve and it should fit. I think I'm going to wing that one. But yeah, the pleated main fabric pieces, now I know this fits, I can make those. I'm still a little bit concerned about, I've got a bit of a sort of 1840s armhole shape here. I don't know whether I want to move that. It does hollow in quite a bit. Maybe I'll scooch that out just a touch. Oh, but then on the, do you know what? I'm going to leave it. It's fine. Okay, I'm taking all this shit off because it's hurting me today. I did decide I needed a sleeve mock-up. I didn't want to risk it not fitting, and I was really worried about the armhole the more I looked at it, so I thought it's better to be safe than sorry, and I threw in a very bitty sleeve mock-up. Oh hey, I'm hardly in the shot, but what I really wanted to show you, I'm not putting the corset on, is the sleeve mock-up. I think I had to piece it together to get a sleeve out. But I actually think it's too big for the armhole. I've got too much ease. Because can you see how it sort of is bubbling a bit there? It's not, that's the sort of amount of ease you would want when the sleeve is up there to get over the roll of the shoulder. But I don't need it to get over the roll of the shoulder. I need it to lie flat over my arm. I quite like the sort of width of it though. I suppose it could come in just a touch. So I think I'm just going to shrink this. I'm going to measure how long it is, and then I'm going to take my tape measure and sort of redraw the top of this curve and see what my new line is going to look like. So it currently measures 44, and I think I need it to measure more like 43. So if I sort of get the tape measure to do that. I used to have one of those like flexi curve things, but it broke. Which is not great, is it? So I think it'll be more like that. That take us to about 43. Yeah, so about there. And then I reckon if we just like round this out a bit. Something like that. It's a bit longer than 43. Oh well, that'll do. Just ease that in a bit nicer. Ta-da! Sleeve version 2. And so what else am I working with? Oh yes, I'll need to adjust that one to match. But also, see here, I've measured off my pins. That's how much I want to lose out of there. So we're just going to do that. This is where I want my dart apex to be. So I'm just going to redraw those like that. And then what I want is a bit to tape on a bit of paper. Probably best to do it like that. Come on, tape. Oh look, I was looking for those and they were in there all along. Much better. So then smashing. Right, so what I'm going to do now is create the main fabric layer with a bit of basic sort of dart manipulation, I'm going to turn these two pattern pieces into these two pattern pieces. So they should match up exactly, and they just have the excess in the shoulder seam and centre front. There was a tape measure somewhere here. Is it around my neck? No. Oh, it's on the floor. Oh my God, the chaos of my mind. So what I wanted to do was see, because obviously it's got quite, if you look at sort of the diagram here, there's more pleats at the centre front than there is at the shoulder. Okay, so I'm going to start by tracing the back. Oh, and I wanted to raise this back neckline as well, actually, didn't I? At least 2 centimetres. Right, so hold what we're doing. So, roughly how much are we working with here? So each pleat is about 1 inch. I need my other pattern cutting, but I can't remember how to do this from memory. Will this be in the back? Yeah. I think I know what I'm doing now.
Once I'd refreshed my memory, I drew a series of curved lines from shoulder seam to centre back. I spaced the lines closer together at the shoulder and further apart at the centre back. I then cut out the pattern piece so that I could do a slash and spread, slashing along those curved lines to add the volume I wanted, and then taping a new bit of paper behind to fill in the gaps. I used the Nora War pattern as a guide for how far apart to space my bits of paper to get the right amount of volume. Only, of course, my pattern is not the exact same size and shape of the pattern which was taken off of an original, much smaller dress. I just tried to keep the proportions about the same so that it would look close enough. Once I had all that extra volume added, I needed to true up the seams. I did this by folding out all that excess I'd just added and pinning the paper in place, putting the original lining piece on top of it, drawing around it, and then trimming all that excess paper off. Looking back on the footage from this, I really struggled with it, and that's because I'd forgotten that the centre back has no darts. Usually you use the dart fullness to create volume, but I couldn't do that for the back, so things just felt really off. When I came to the front, I finally realised what was going wrong with the back, and the front piece went much more smoothly. You can see I've moved the dart to the centre front seam, opening up the volume where I want to put my pleats. Much easier. With the pattern pieces complete, I could start cutting my fabric. I tore off the panels I would need to make the skirt, so I knew just how much fabric I had left for the bodice. I also tore off what I would need for the skirt lining, at least what I thought I might need. I still wasn't sure what I was going to do about the skirt lining. Then I could start cutting the fabric. I recruited my glamorous assistant to help with this. Not only was it a time thing, but as you know, cutting is hard for me because of my energy limiting condition. We used the dining table because it's bigger and easier to sit at. I instructed my assistant how to pin things on the straight of grain, or on the bias, and then drew on all the seam allowances. I then gave very clear instructions about cutting on the chalk line, not around the paper piece. An easy mistake to make even for more experienced makers. I was very grateful for the assistance, not only for the sake of my back and knees, but it was a classic case of many hands make light work. It did take a while to prep everything, pin it out, chalk it up, etc. But a lot of that I could do sat down, and then the actual cutting was done in a few minutes. We had prepped the lining pieces at the same time as the main, so we could just move on to those straight away, and the more complicated pieces that had to match up or that I had forgotten when making the paper pattern, like the cuffs, I tackled while Mum made sterling work of the bodice pieces. Obviously it helps if you can find a glamorous assistant with some experience of dressmaking, but careful supervision and guidance makes all the difference. Now here you'll see me doing 2 marking up methods I never normally use. Firstly, I marked the darts on the lining fabric using tailor's tacks. In this case, the darts are very straightforward to sew and there's only 2 of them, so it was just the quickest way to transfer the information from the pattern. For my other markings, I used pencil. Now I usually use chalk or carbon transfer paper, but I did a test and the marks from the coloured chalk and the carbon paper were very visible because my main fabric is so sheer and light in colour. So the pencil is less noticeable because it just looks like a shadow. You might also have noticed I have only 1 centimetre of seam allowance on this dress. I never worked with such small seam allowances, but I was so short on fabric, I had to make some sacrifices. Before making up the bodice, each layer of fabric got a good press, and then I could start mounting the gathered fabric pieces onto the smaller lining pieces. At first, I fussed around a lot with the tape measure, trying to get them to not only be even, but to match the ones on the original Nora War dress. But I soon gave up on that. I often have to remind myself that trying to perfectly recreate the past is futile. It's never going to be accurate to an original for a multitude of reasons outside of my control. What I actually want is for it to look good and be easy to sew. I imagine in a way that's actually the highest form of accuracy, because the original dress was either made by a home seamstress with 1,000,001 other things to worry about, or it was made in a sweatshop by mistreated workers, either of whom were probably not worrying about the perfect proportions of their pleats. In the end, I went for what looks good and trusted my instincts. Looking back at this, I wish I had added more volume in the back. I didn't do a great job of the pattern cutting, and it looks a bit lackluster as a result. But then I remember I was really tight on fabric, so maybe I couldn't have added more volume. For the front, I changed tact and decided to sew some hand-gathering threads in the front section to help manage the volume. The one concession to precision I made was to try and match the pleats over the shoulder seam. That's the thing with these slightly off-the-shoulder gowns, the shoulder seam becomes very prominent, so I took the time to try and get it to match. Now you might have spotted my mistake before I did here. I was going to all the effort of pleating the outer fabric onto the lining, but I hadn't sewn the darts in the front pieces yet. No wonder I was struggling. So I had to carefully unpin everything and sew up the darts. Again, here I'm doing something I don't usually do and reversing at the tip of my darts. I do it very carefully to prevent a pucker, but I was making this dress with the intention of being able to machine wash it, so I chose this option as it's stronger than tying the threads together. And it's going to be covered with fabric, so if it looks a bit bulky at the end, it's not going to be seen anyway. With the darts sewn, I removed my tailor's tack, which was a bit tricky, so I was glad I'd used this not too noticeable light blue thread, and then I could press the darts towards the centre front. I could then return to mounting the main fabric on the lining and organising all those pleats at the centre front. With the gathers, I still wanted them to line nicely, so I couldn't help but fuss about with them for ages before pinning them in place. And I also tried to get the two halves of the centre front to match across the seam like I had done for the shoulders before I had to redo it. I could then start working on the little sleeve puff decorations. I had to piece the fabric together to get enough width to gather down, but as we know, piecing is period. I then penciled on some lines according to the diagram in Nora War to gather down the fabric, and then sewed long gathering stitches along those lines using my sewing machine. The time for hand gathering was long past. While I was at it, I also gathered the top and bottom edge of the lower sleeve pieces. Then, using a similar method to the way I'd mounted the pleats on the bodice, I pulled up the gathering threads, pleated the edges, and stitched the puffs in position onto the lining fabric. I also attached the top half of the sleeve main fabric to the puffy section before mounting it onto the lining, so I could hide that seam a bit better. I then used the overlocker to actually sew all the main pieces to the lining pieces. With hindsight, I wish I had tacked over the pleated sections on the sewing machine first, because the overlocker definitely pushed the pleats and gathers around, undoing a lot of my hard work spent fussing with them to get them just right. But I was going for speed at this point, so I guess I didn't have time for that. I also overlocked the raw edges of the pieces that weren't lined, like the lower sleeves. I was using the selvages for my skirt panels, so I didn't need to overlock those, thankfully. I could then make up the sleeves. I matched both ends of the lower sleeve to the bottom of the decorative ruffled section and then pulled on the gathering threads to shrink it down to be the right size. I didn't start the gathers right at the seam to allow for a flat section at the underarm. I then smoothed the gathers as best I could and pinned them in place. I then went into task batching mode, pinning as many things together as I could before getting my sewing machine back out. You might have noticed I skipped drawing on my sewing lines. As I was using such a narrow seam allowance and such a light coloured fabric, I decided to skip it. There wasn't a suitable way to mark it up that wouldn't show on the finished garment, and I didn't have time to go through and remove lots of markings. I did use a tracing wheel to make some pinprick marks on some seams, but they haven't shown up on camera. With everything pinned, I could machine everything together. I took my time over the pleated and gathered sections. My experience with the overlocker had taught me to be careful, and as I was also now sewing from the wrong side, I couldn't see if I was catching anything I shouldn't. The sleeves were particularly tricky to do. With hindsight, I should have used a narrower foot, like a zipper foot, because the bulk of the poofed decoration made it really hard to get this under the sewing machine, and I was sewing gathers to gathers. It was a tricky one. Then it was time to crack out the iron and give everything a good press. Much like the 1840s bodice, most of the seams were curved, so I relied heavily on my tailor's ham. But some of the seams were flat, so I could use my wool pressing mat, and boy, if I thought sewing that sleeve seam was tricky, I was not prepared to try and iron it. I had to get a bit creative with the edge of the iron to avoid crushing the puffs. The only part of the sleeves I was yet to work on was the cuffs. I cut some fusible interfacing for the main fabric and used my iron to press it in place. I'm really pressing here, as in actually pressing down on the iron with a lot of pressure to really get the glue to fuse to the fabric. It was also at this point that I realised I was going to need some piping. I cut the very little scrap fabric I had left into bias strips using my scissors. I said it in the last video, and I'll say it again. I can't use a rotary cutter because they're not safe for me to use because of my disability, so please don't comment to tell me to use one. And once again, right on cue, my hand stops working and I flick something across the sewing machine, and that's why I don't feel safe using a rotary cutter. Here, I'm joining the lining fabric to the main fabric of the cuffs that I just interfaced. I'm seaming up the cuffs in one with the sleeve, so I'm only joining it on one edge. I then make my piping by wrapping the bias strips I'd cut around a 3mm piping cord and sewing it tightly, but not too tightly, in place using a zipper foot. With the piping made up, I pinned it along the sewing line around the neck and began machining it in place again with the zipper foot. I sewed just inside my previous row of stitching, making the cord even snugger in the casing, but also hiding any visible stitching from the right side. The point of the V neckline was a bit tricky, but I had deliberately not sewn the seam closed past the beginning of the seam allowance when joining the centre fronts. This then acted like a snip into the seam so that I could pivot the fabric around to sew it in smoothly without any puckers. With the last few bits of sewing done in that batch, I got the iron out to start pressing. First the cuffs and then the piping around to the inside of the neckline. I soon gave up trying to do it on the flat table and dug out my tailor's ham once again, making it much easier.
So I've had a funny sort of few days with this. I think the last thing you saw me do was on Thursday, and then I powered through all Friday so that I could take the weekend off, and I've kind of gotten back at it this afternoon. I had some other sort of work things to do in the morning, and I realised I hadn't filmed anything. So I thought I'd give you an update. So the sleeves are now made up and on. I absolutely love them. I made the sleeves up flat, and then when I came to join them, none of this lined up, despite the fact that I traced an identical curve for the underarm seam. I had to pleat one half of it, it didn't fit. And it's just one of those things, I've just gone with it. Because this is a much lower stakes kind of garment than the ball gown, I'm rushing through it, I know it, that means I do have to compromise on quality. I have still, however, managed to herringbone down the piping, and the sleeves are now in. They went in surprisingly well. I'm very happy with how that went. Tacked them in first, which always makes a difference. What I need to do now is I need to make up the skirt, make up a waistband, and because these are dresses, they're not a separate bodice and a skirt, I have to attach it all together. However, I have this dilemma because this pink fabric is only 90 centimetres wide, and the white cotton I've been using as my flat lining is 115. So I don't know how I'm going to flatline it. I need to think about that one. And it's 4:45, and it's not a great time to start thinking out puzzles like that. So I was going to just attach the waistband to the bodice, ready to go. And I realised I've only got really scrappy bits of this pink left. And I have ordered 2 more meters of it, which is supposed to come in the post today, and it hasn't. So part of me is like, should I just piece together scraps and make a waistband? Would that really annoy me? Or shall I just wait for the fabric to arrive? But I'm really running out of tasks I can do because I don't want to bone the bodice until I've attached the skirt, because that will make sewing on the waistband, or at least attach the waistband, because that will make it really difficult and I might hit the bones. Tricky. I'm kind of stuck. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention was I didn't end up piping the armhole because I don't have any piping cord left, so I just left it. Like I say, I'm doing a lot of compromising on this project. What I might do is I might just run the pink skirt panels together so that they're all joined together, and then I know how much of the white cotton I need to cut off from one panel. Then that's at least something. Yeah, I think that's what I'm going to do. Nice easy task to finish the day.
As the pink cotton was so narrow, I used minimal seam allowances and just matched the selvages up as I went on the panels I had torn up earlier. Using the selvage means I don't have to do an edge finish, and I skipped the pins because it's just a straight seam and I needed to save time. I did the same thing with the white quilt cotton panels before I had an important realisation.
So I've been joining together the panels on my white cotton. However, because this is quilt cotton, it's very stiff. It's also very heavy. It's very densely woven and sort of solid. And I need to cut down as much weight as possible if I'm going to have any chance of surviving this weekend. It's just too heavy. I'll faint with the weight of it all. So this is 3 45-inch wide panels, and it's heavier than that mid-19th century petticoat I made to go under the ball dress, which is 2 lots of 90-inch wide lawn. I can't use this. I bought this fabric and now I can't use it. So I've done a bit of research and I've looked at some examples I've been able to find online, and there are examples of skirts that are both lined and completely unlined. It also says in the Workwoman's Guides that skirts in this era are usually lined with cotton, so I don't think it will be the end of the world if I don't line the skirt. But that does leave me a dilemma about the petticoats I wear, because I have that massive one, which is basically going to be twice the circumference of the dress, and I'm not sure how that will look. I have the organdy one, which is slimmer but not very dense. Do I need another petticoat? I think let's make up the skirt. Oh yeah, my fabric that was supposed to arrive yesterday still isn't here, despite coming by FedEx, so I have 2 days before I leave for Bath. I think I'm just going to have to make up the skirt, even if I just sort of baste it onto a length of cotton tape temporarily or something, and try it on with various petticoats to see how it looks and how I feel. Great.
I actually decided I should probably finish the bodice first before I even worried about my flat-lining petticoat dilemma. So I added the bone to the centre back. Yes, the original said it had a cord, but I'd run out of piping cord, but I did have some spiral steel left. I had made a facing piece for the centre back edge, so there is a seam along the edge of the bone, but I still wanted to have a lot of fabric in there for alterations. I had used the selvage for the edge of the facing, so I didn't have to finish anything, and then I just herringboned it down to the lining. I made the decision to piece the waistband, instead of wasting time waiting for my fabric to arrive. I tried to get the seams to line up with the side seams so that it wasn't as obvious it had been pieced together. I cut a strip of fusible interfacing for the waistband and then ironed it on over the seams so it hopefully would reinforce those areas. And then I pleated down the front of the skirt and tacked those pleats in place on the machine. A bit like with the ball gown, I was quite free with my pleats. So long as they looked okay from the front, I was fine with them being a bit wonky on the back. I also wasn't adding a pocket to this dress to save time, so that made the pleats easier. I still went very slowly, smoothing everything in place so I didn't catch anything I wasn't supposed to. For the back half of the skirt, I ran 2 lines of machine basting along the top to gather that section down. I didn't have time for hand gathering or cartridge pleating, so machine gathers it was, and I was running them through the machine so fast I wobbled the camera out of position. I then attached the waistband to the bodice and then carefully machined the pleated and gathered down skirt to the bottom half of the waistband. I had decided at this point that I just wasn't going to bother with a lining. I had less than 2 days to try and get this dress done, and I thought I'd rather have a slightly droopy skirt to wear than nothing at all. I then had to level the hem. As I had torn the fabric into panels, they were all over the place, and so I drew in the hemline I wanted before trimming everything down to do a narrow rolled hem. I briefly entertained the idea of facing the skirt with organdy, but I couldn't get it to work, so I had to abandon that plan. I cut the hem down to about 1 inch, this was because that's the maximum I could get away with on my shortest panel, turned under the raw edge about 0.5 centimetre using my iron, and then folded up the hem to the right length. I basted all the way around the hem on the sewing machine because I knew I wanted to do a machine blind hem. A machine blind hem requires a special foot, and you have to do a lot of tinkering with your machine settings to set it up to get it to look right, but when it works, it's an incredibly quick way to hem a skirt like this, and you have an almost invisible finish. You can't get it quite as invisible as if you did it by hand, but it's certainly good enough for me. With the skirt hemmed, I was on to the last few finishing touches. I needed a facing for the waistband to enclose all those raw edges. I used white cotton for this to match the lining of the bodice. I stitched the facing to the seam allowance of the bodice and waistband seam and then pressed it down over the seam allowances of the waistband, turning up the raw edge and pinning it in place from the right side to hide the seam with the skirt. I also pressed the hem of the skirt while I had the iron out. I had pinned the waistband facing in place from the right side because I knew I wanted to do a sink stitch, or a stitch in the ditch, to secure it in place. Wrestling the boned bodice of the dress through the sewing machine was tricky, but I do still think it was quicker than hand sewing it at this point. I did hand sew the ends of the waistband in place. I had deliberately left them longer to fold back over the white facing so that I would have a little bit of extra fabric should I need to let the dress out and to make sure none of the white showed from the outside. But with that, we were finally onto the hooks and bars, the last step. As you can see, I was expertly filming this final step of the process. This was 2 days before I left for Bath, but with the fastenings on, the dress was done. I'd made it with a day to spare. I didn't end up wearing this outfit for very long in Bath, but I am glad I made it. Unlike the ball gown that turned out just as I wanted, this one... I'll save you all my nitpicking, but really it comes down to the fact I don't love the colour on me. But I actually had a lot of fun making this, despite the tight deadline, and so I can still look on it fondly. As I finished with a day to spare, I even had time to make myself some accessories to match. Mostly, I'm just really proud of myself. I did it. I got to go to the ball. Thanks for watching. See you next time.